Bronze Age Atlantis with Tony Petrangelo. You're listening to Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons, monsters and serpents, to Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 tangent cube of science, nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed high atop the Everest Plateau. And we are joined by the Watcher. He is en route from space station to space station, so he won't be coming in to talk to us, but he is listening and will be contributing with text and helping us out, keeping us on the straight and narrow in terms of the truth, hopefully. I mean, I don't know if he can do that with Tony, who is joining us again. Tony was here last time at episode 167, which was titled Plato, Timaeus, and Atlantis, and we kind of went through the works of Plato that in regards to Atlantis with him. It was a great show, and so we're having him come back now to basically that show. Tony was like you were working up to something, right? So now we're going to the real deal. This is the real stuff. Bronze Age Atlantis.
Well, it depends on, I guess, your point of view. This is what you wanted me to talk about the first time.
That's right.
Talked about a whole bunch of other stuff. So.
That's right.
You screwed us over.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I mean, he said he had it all planned out. He was like, "This is how I make sure I can get on the show again."
Oh,
yeah, I know.
It worked.
Yeah, it did. So, Bronze Age Atlantis, this is the reason I initially asked you to come on. Well, not so much the Atlantis part, but really because when you and I were arguing about whether Atlantis was in the Bronze Age or in the Ice Age, you had all this great information about the Bronze Age and the Bronze Age collapse and the Sea Peoples and the mystery of that. And I was like, dude, you just need to come on the show and let's talk about this stuff. So that's why you came on the first one, and that's why you're here again today, right?
Sounds good.
Yeah. And so this one is a slideshow presentation. So we are recording video, so there will be video available on the YouTube channel once good old Brandon History Shift gets that done. So people should check that out too, as well as listening to the audio show. All right, so Tony, where are we going?
And just to reiterate that, I'll try to talk through it and not depend on the visuals so much, but there are a lot of maps and other sort of visual helpers that might be. Like, I've never watched the podcast on YouTube before, but this might be one that you might want to check out on YouTube just because there are some helpful visual aids. But I'll try not to depend on those too much.
Okay.
And just one thing, just real quick, I want to just, at least for me, when I first came across Bronze Age Atlantis, it was a bit of a trigger. Like, I had been an Ice Age Atlantis person for a long time. And so I remember when Disney Plus first came out, and this is like, I just looked at this recently. It's not even a year ago, or just a year ago. There's a documentary on there by James Cameron about Atlantis, and it goes through all these different, hypotheses about where it could be, and it's all based in the Bronze Age, though. And they kept saying throughout the documentary, "Oh, well, this one fits because it's from the Bronze Age too." And I kept in my mind being like, "But it's an Ice Age story." So it wasn't long ago that I was in that same boat, and that I understand like coming across ideas of Bronze Age Atlantis and being like, it's an Ice Age thing. So I just kind of want to make sure, like, we're going to go through some of the reasons why I think it is a Bronze Age story. But, this is just my take. Everybody has their own take on this.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
Just don't get too triggered by the idea of a Bronze Age Atlantis.
I'm not buying it.
So before we get into anything too much, I just want to go over the Bronze Age in general. So it starts approximately 3500 BC, with the emergence of Egyptian and Sumerian civilization, and ends around 1200 BC when everything just collapses, essentially. The period we're mainly going to be talking about here tonight is the Late Bronze Age. So that starts around 1600 BC, essentially the period after the eruption of Santorini. And it marks the rise of the Mycenaean civilization, essentially the Bronze Age Greeks, who in the Hittite text they're referred to as the Ahiawans, but they're known as the Mycenaeans. You'll see a lot of times they'll call the Mycenaeans because the Mycenae was the main sort of like kingdom of the Mycenaean kingdom. That's the kingdom that Agamemnon was head of, who was the leader of the Greeks during the Trojan War. So you'll hear them referred to as Mycenaeans or Ahiawans, or just Greeks. Also, the Hittite empire emerges in this time. And so the Hittites, they first emerged sort of earlier than this, but their actual empire sort of kind of comes into being around this time, where they conquer a lot of Western Anatolia and a lot of areas in northern Syria. And then the New Kingdom Egyptians emerge around this time as well. So before this period, the Egyptians had been sort of just like in Egypt. This is where they kind of start conquering lands in southern Syria or in like the Lebanon area, also going down to Nubia, conquering areas down there and expanding their area into like what would actually be considered like an empire. A lot of is known about this area because there's been a lot of like caches of diplomatic texts that have been found, and not just diplomatic, but like just, record keeping and other sorts of texts. The one example a lot of people are familiar with is in Amarna, Egypt. And Amarna is the period when Akhenaten was the pharaoh. And a lot of people are familiar with Akhenaten for being the heretic pharaoh, quote unquote, or whatever.
That's him up there on the graphic, right?
His father and then him had set up this city called Amarna, and that was their main area. And so that's where a lot of these texts were found in Amarna, Egypt. And so unlike most stuff in Egyptian, this is all the diplomatic stuff is all written in Assyrian. That's sort of like the diplomatic language of the time. So all the Amarna stuff is all in Assyrian, but there's also caches have been found in Atusa, which was the capital of the Hittite Empire, but all over in different places in Anatolia, in Assyria, and Babylon, Crete, different places in Greece. And then the city called Ugarit has a bunch of different texts have been found there as well. Ugarit's sort of northern Syria, right on the coast. And so so that's sort of like the lay of the land, I guess you'd say, in the late Bronze Age. And then the thing that happens at the end that everybody talks about a lot is the actual collapse. So you had this whole period for thousands of years where everything was, there was kind of ups and downs, and there was other sort of kind of collapses in there where individual civilizations might collapse. But at 1200, essentially everything collapses. And so there's all throughout Greece, there's a map on the screen right now showing every city that's on this map was destroyed around 1200 BC. Wow. And there's, they're all over the place. So all over Greece, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes, Lefkandi, Knossos in Crete, Miletus in Western Anatolia, Troy, basically the entire island of Cyprus, all over northern Syria, all over Lebanon, all up into central and eastern Anatolia. Just cities all over the place are destroyed. So, one of the big questions is what happened? Why did they get destroyed? Some of them, like Ugarit, were definitely destroyed by warfare. There's, arrowheads found all over the city. There's obviously it was burnt, so that, a lot of indications of warfare, but some cities were just abandoned. Some cities there's evidence of fire without necessarily evidence of warfare. So it's sort of, with a lot of these different cities, there's a lot of dispute about what actually caused, that particular location to get destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. But all over the Eastern Mediterranean, places just got destroyed. So something happened. The thing is, too, this is circa 1200, all this happened. But, that kind of spans a fairly long time frame in which that could have happened. So some of these cities could have been destroyed around 1225, some as late as 1175. So it's not necessarily like they all got destroyed at exactly the same time, but there's a kind of period in which they could have been
Tony,
destroyed here.
Can you mute Brett real quick? Mute his mic. All right, thank you.
I was hearing something. I wasn't sure what that was.
Yeah, that was the spaceship vacuum cleaner.
There you go. So the most common causes that are attributed to this collapse, for the longest time, the Sea Peoples, which we'll get into a lot later, was what everybody attributed everything to. Oh, the Sea Peoples did it. The Sea Peoples did it. More recently, people have kind of relooked at that. A lot of these cities show evidence of being destroyed by earthquakes. There's people like trapped under, falling walls and stuff like that. So that's thought to be evidence of earthquakes. And there certainly was a lot of earthquakes in this area at this time. There's certainly been evidence recovered recently of drought and famine. So you can see through like pollen samples that, the plants during this time just weren't growing as well. There's also been evidence in a lot of these places of just a lot of depopulation. So then, some people will say systems collapse as well. I put that in quotes because to me, that just kind of is another way of saying collapse. Yeah. It's like a tautology kind of. Right. But, essentially that like the system was so complex back then that once one thing started to fail, everything else started to fail is kind of the idea. And then the other thing that, I think like Eric Klein in his 1177 BC book basically just says all of the above.
Right.
All of these things were all happening at the same time, and it just contributed to, the collapse of civilization. We'll kind of get into some of that stuff and why maybe it was another contributing factor.
And with the earthquakes, they were saying it was like it's qualified as an earthquake storm. Is that what they said? Or
so it's hard to know if that's what happened or if there was just a couple really, really big earthquakes.
Yeah. Okay.
But there was certainly evidence of multiple kind of phases of earthquakes. Some cities were destroyed multiple times, like Troy has evidence of destruction in 1300 and then around 1200. Mycenae has evidence of destruction around 1250 and then again around 1200. And some of the earlier destructions are thought to be earthquakes, and then some of the later destructions are, it's all, a lot of this is also disputed.
Okay.
Basically every city scholars have different ideas about what caused the destruction of that particular location.
Yeah. Okay.
So a lot of this stuff is, in dispute. So it's just a lot of it is, it's really hard to know because even nowadays with arson investigation, it's hard to know what caused the fire in the first place.
Yeah.
And now we're talking thousands of years ago trying to figure out what caused a fire.
Right.
So, a lot of these cities, what they know is they were destroyed by fire. Is it, maybe the city was abandoned and then the fire was just happened because there was nobody there to put it out.
Yeah. And in some cases,
like there's a lot of ways a city can be destroyed by fire.
In some cases, the palace is the only thing that burned, but the surrounding city didn't. So it's like they burned the palace and then everybody left or something. It's like there's really interesting differences.
And so, some cities are like that where it's just sort of like the what you call, I guess, the aristocratic or like the power structures are destroyed.
Yeah.
And like the houses aren't, but then some cities like just everything's destroyed.
Everything's destroyed. Yeah.
Yeah. It's every kind of location is a little bit different as far as what, and so you kind of to get into that is a whole different thing as far as individual locations and what caused the destruction.
Yeah.
And we'll get into it a little bit with some locations, but just, suffice it to say a lot of bad stuff was going on around 1200 BC in a lot of different places.
Yeah.
So before we get too much into the Bronze Age, I just want to, address the fact that Plato clearly says 9,000 years in Timaeus and in Critias. So why are we talking about the Bronze Age? So in Timaeus, Plato says, and I'll just kind of go over this. We talked about some of this stuff in the previous episode, but I'm just going to reiterate a couple things. So you are welcome to hear about them, Solon, said the priest, both for your own sake and for that of your city, and above all for the sake of the goddess, who is the common patron and parent and educator of both our cities. She founded your city 1,000 before ours, receiving from the earth and Hephaestus the seed of your race, and afterwards she founded ours, of which the constitution is recorded in our sacred registers to be 8,000 years old. As touching of your citizens 9,000 years ago, I will briefly inform you of your laws and their most famous action. So he's clearly saying here 9,000 years, and this is in Timaeus. In Critias, he again says 9,000 years twice. Let me begin first of all by observing that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war, which was said to have taken place between those who dwelled outside the pillars of Hercules and all those who dwelt within them. And then later on in Critias, he says, many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking.
Yeah.
So he reiterates this multiple times, 9,000 years, 9,000 years, 9,000 years.
Right. So it's not a scribal error.
So there's a lot of different ways people try to explain away the 9,000 years. So one of them would be like mistranslation, misinterpretation. Through the years it got, either scribal error, like you said, or something with Solon misinterpreting it from the priest or something like that. I'm a little bit dubious of this. Like, the Egyptians and the Greeks at the time, the first, above all else, their relationship was a trade relationship. Numbers are very important to trade relationships. I'm very dubious that numbers are things that get mistranslated very often.
Yeah.
It just seems like that's a very important thing to get translated right.
That's a good point. That's a really good point.
To me is a little bit dubious. A lot of people who are supporters of the Minoan hypothesis will say, well, Plato just multiplied everything by 10. So that's how you get from 900 years to 9,000 years. That's how you get a plane that is, way too big to fit in Crete. I'm also a little dubious of this. It just seems like a little bit too, easy of a solution to say he multiplied everything by 10. Like Stavros Papameronopoulos says that, and this is true, the Egyptian priests use a lunar calendar, and then they also use the solar calendar for some settings and then a lunar calendar in other settings. And there was just a mix up between the lunar and the solar calendar. and again, I mean, I guess this is possible, but that it seems like if you're the priest and you're dealing with these calendars, you're going to know which calendar means what and what years are and what months are and the relationship between Greek years and Egyptian years and all that kind of stuff. None of those things really necessarily sell me. I'm just kind of like,
but is it,
you guys know what other explanations are out there?
Is it correct that if it was a lunar calendar number that it would put it right at the end of the Bronze Age? Is that right? Because I've heard people say that. It would put it
right around there, more like 1300, but kind of like right around the end of the Bronze Age. Yeah, right. I mean, you're getting in that ballpark for sure.
The other thing is
multiplying everything by 10. That gives you 900 years before Solon, which is like 1500 BC.
But if it was 900 years, would Solon and know any history of 900 years before himself? They're trying to say that they've forgotten multiple destructions of the world in 900 years.
Well, we'll get to that. That comes up. Don't worry. We'll definitely get to that.
All right.
Fine.
We'll address that later. So I want to just put that off till there's the slide for that.
Well, I got one other tangent. That first name, I can't remember what it was on your first map. It was like, it sounds like Hawaii.
Ahiawa.
Yeah. It's just strange to me that it sounds so similar to Hawaii. Like you could almost make the same word out of it.
Yeah.
I find that kind of stuff interesting.
Yeah. Etymology.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the linguistic breakdown of I know Hittite's an Indo-European language, but that's about as much as I know about that. So one thing I just want to say, so Plato in the laws, he has this comment about Egypt being over 10,000 years old. So he's talking about sort of like their culture. And so I'll just read this quote. Long ago, they appear to have recognized the very principle of which we are now speaking, that their young citizens must be habituated to forms and strains of virtue. These they fix and exhibited the patterns of them in their temples, and no painter or artist is allowed to innovate upon them or to leave the traditional forms and invent new ones. To this day, no alteration is allowed either in these arts or in music at all, and you will find that their works of art are painted or molded in the same forms which they had 10,000 years ago. This is literally true and no exaggeration. Their ancient paintings and sculptures are not a whit better or worse than the work of today, but are made with just the same skill. So to me, he's clearly describing a continuous sort of culture of art over 10,000 years. And regardless of what we want to talk about, like the age of Egypt and the Sphinx and stuff like that, I don't necessarily know if anybody's arguing that dynastic Egypt is that old.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what he's kind of talking about here is dynastic Egypt. And so it just seems to me like maybe Plato and other Greeks, Herodotus, who I'm going to get into, might just be misinformed about how old Egypt is. So Herodotus in his histories says, thus far went the record given to me by the Egyptians and their priests, and they showed me that the time from the first king to that priest of Hephaestus, who is the last, covered 341 generations of men, and that in this time such also had been the number of their kings and of their high priests. Now 300 generations make up 10,000 years, 3 generations being equal to a century. And over and above the 300, the remaining 41 cover 1,340 years. Thus, the whole sum is 11,340 years. Now, I think you can see right away where you could get errors by assuming that every generation had a single king and then multiplying the number of kings you have to get the age of a civilization, which it seems like is like what he's doing here.
Yeah.
He's taking a king's list. The priests are assuming that each king was reigned for a single generation, and then they're looking back and adding that all up and multiplying it, and they're getting, all right, 11,340 years.
Right.
So there's certainly political reasons at this time. This is, Solon's there in like 570 BC. Egypt at this point is not anywhere near like Egypt of, the Egypt of the glory years.
Right.
And they'd been kind of subject to a bunch of foreign rulers by this point in time. So they're sort of incentivized to play up the ancientness of their culture. They're sort of incentivized to, take these numbers and make them maybe seem as old as they can make them seem. Now, if we just do some back of the envelope math, and this is just, I went to Wikipedia, I got all the different rulers from all the different kingdoms. Obviously, Herodotus didn't have the Wikipedia list. The kings, the priests of Egypt didn't have the Wikipedia list. So I'm not trying to say like this is the same list Herodotus saw or anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to give you an example of how this could cause, a counting of time to be off. So even if you go back to the Old Kingdom, with the total number of kings versus the total number of years, you're getting up to like an average of 21 years per king. Middle Kingdom, 23 years per king. But then the New Kingdom, 14 years per king. Late Kingdom, 15. Some of these intermediate periods where you have multiple pharaohs reigning, you have one in the Lower Egypt, one in Upper Egypt.
Yeah.
Some reigning for like months at a time before others are taking over. Who knows what this actual number is? If you count them up on Wikipedia in the second intermediate period, you can get to a number like 150. A lot of these kings are in dispute, so this isn't necessarily like I didn't do a detailed study and find out exactly what the number is or anything. This is all just back of the envelope math to just be real kind of rough and say, if you kind of just take all these kings, throw them in a bucket, divide everything, you get her around 8 years per reign. So maybe that's a rough number. Maybe you want to tweak that a little bit.
Yeah.
But you can easily
25.
see how you can get from 341 kings times like 8 or times 10. That leads you right to around 3100 BC, where Egyptian civilization supposedly started. So just to try to say how possibly I think the number got screwed up between Herodotus and Solon and the priests of Egypt and Plato. I think it's just, they have a list of kings and they're assuming each one was a generation and they're counting them and multiplying, and that's where they get to 10,000 or 9,000 or whatever.
Did he really multiply it by 33.3?
Well, he said three generations per century.
Okay.
So I don't necessarily know how he did the math specifically, but that would, 3 per century.
That would be 33.3.
That's a good point. All right.
So here's one other thing. Plato, beyond the 9,000 years, Plato dates Atlantis in one other way. So in Critias, he talks about, at one point he says, "For the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rock. At the same time, there were earthquakes, and then occurred the extraordinary inundation, which was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion." Now, the destruction of Deucalion, this is the third before the great destruction of Deucalion. This is talked about in a couple different books I've read. Apparently, the ancient Greeks counted inclusively. So if you're saying the third before, it was hard for me to
really
understand
only
this
two.
at first as well. It means the one that they're counting to is part of the counting. So it's actually like the way we would say it would be like the second before.
Okay, yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense. But
the one before this one. Yeah, is that how we would say it?
A number of books have pointed that out, and I don't know enough to dispute that. So anyways, this is from here. This little graphic is from the book Sunken Kingdom by actually an academic named Peter James. And this is sort of his diagram of Plato's sort of view of how this all is. So the flood of Deucalion is like 1500 BC. The Greeks kind of knew that was in their normal mythological sort of wheelhouse. So they knew it wasn't super ancient. It was in like the birth of their civilization kind of range. And then this is the second one before that. So, there was another event, and then there's the flood, the event, the destruction of Atlantis event. So obviously this takes us, well outside of, I was saying right at the front, we're talking the late Bronze Age, which is essentially after 1500 BC. And right here, Plato's saying it's before that.
Right.
I don't necessarily have a cute explanation for that, like I did for the 9,000 years, other than to say that Plato thought it was 9,000 years old. So he put it before Deucalion's flood, which he knew was not 9,000 years old. Okay. One thing I would say as far as the cyclical events, and this is getting back to your point earlier, Kyle, so this is from a book called Exodus to Author, and this was written by a dendrochronologist named Mike Bailey. And he found these tree ring events that he found, they're essentially worldwide tree ring events. So they show up in tree ring chronologies worldwide, meaning there were environmental downturns that affected multiple tree ring sequences all around the world. So there was one in 1159 BC, which is where I think the Atlantis destruction was. But then there was one in 628 BC, which would maybe correspond to Deucalion's flood. Then there was another one in 2354 BC, and then another one 3195 BC, which would correspond. So two before would correspond to the one maybe, Peter James had shown in his kind of listing of events. You know what I mean? So when you were looking, when he had it charted out, there was a huge gap between the 1500 BC event and then two events before was the 9500 BC event.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit more condensed where
two events
there's
before is
two
3195.
events, but they're all kind of within a time frame where the Egyptians were around for it. They would have recorded those events. They would have seen these multiple cyclical destructions that were happening. So it kind of all fits. The only problem with this really is at this point, Plato's putting it before the Deucalion event, and I think it's after. So that's sort of the one bug, I guess you'd say.
Okay.
But we'll get to a lot of the evidence for why I think it is an end of the Bronze Age event right now, basically. So just a few miscellaneous clues before we get to the bulk of it. The bulk of the evidence is really going to be the description of Athens in Critias. Okay. So the majority of the Plato stuff we're going to be dealing with today is Critias. I'm going to revisit right here some stuff from Timaeus and then maybe a little bit more, but it's mostly going to be stuff from Critias. So a few miscellaneous Bronze Age clues. And we talked about this in the last episode, but in Timaeus he says, and this is the Egyptian priest talking, whereas in this land, neither then nor at any other time does the water come down from above on the fields, having always a tendency to come up from below, for which reason the traditions preserved here are the most ancient. So this is just another reinforcing that the time frame of Egyptian civilization that the priest is familiar with, they don't get water from the sky.
Yeah.
Which again kind of fits with Egypt, with this not being an Ice Age story, with Egypt not having, with this priest of Egypt at least not having a memory of when Egypt was, a swamp or whatever.
Right.
And then there's another later on. This is towards the end when he's describing the destruction. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. So again, he seems to imply that the shoal of mud is still there.
Yeah. And
if this had indeed happened, would it be 9,000 years ago at that time? The shoals of mud probably would have been washed away by the ocean by that time. I mean, maybe not, but the amount of sea level rise that happened at the end of the Ice Age probably would have covered up any shoals. I don't know. This isn't necessarily like, proof of anything. It just kind of points to the idea that it seems unlikely that there'd still be shoals, 8,000, 9,000 years after the event happened.
Yeah. I always took it to mean that maybe there was a shallow area, but yeah, I don't think that it would still be a muddy water. But yeah.
And it could be that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
That it was, it sank in this area because of isostatic rebound. It didn't sink as much.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things this could mean. This doesn't necessarily disprove anything. It's just one kind of thing that a little bit is in favor of the Bronze Age thing. So a couple more miscellaneous things before we get to the Athens stuff. So, and this is from Critias, and this is descriptions of Atlantis itself, which we're actually not going to get into a whole lot this episode, surprisingly enough. So the leader was required to furnish for the war the sixth portion of a war chariot, so as to make up a total of 10,000 chariots, also 2 horses and riders for them, and a pair of chariot horses without a seat, accompanied by a horseman who could fight on foot carrying a small shield, and having a charioteer who stood behind the man-at-arms to guide the 2 horses. Also, he was bound to furnish 2 heavy-armed soldiers, 2 archers, 2 slingers, 3 stone shooters, and 3 javelin men, who were light-armed, and 4 sailors to make up the complement of 1,200 ships. So this is a pretty good description of Bronze Age warfare. Chariots. The chariots were usually accompanied by people on feet to sort of like be the chariot minders.
Yeah.
You have heavy armed soldiers, you have archers, slingers, stone shooters. This is obviously, it's not only confined to the Bronze Age, but this is a pretty good description of Bronze Age warfare.
Yeah.
And then the last one would be the bulls in the temple. So there were bulls who had range of the temple of Poseidon, and the 10 kings being left alone in the temple after they had offered prayers to the god that they might capture the victim, which was acceptable to him, hunted the bulls without weapons, but with staves and nooses. And the bull which they caught, they led up to the pillar and cut its throat over the top of it so that the blood fell upon the sacred inscription.
Yeah.
And just that bulls, if we're looking at things from a processional point of view, bulls are clearly
Taurus,
not Ice Age. This is more like not necessarily completely overlapping with the Bronze Age, but somewhat overlapping with the Bronze Age would be the Age of Taurus. So just a little, another kind of hint that we're dealing with maybe some Bronze Age stuff here.
What was the Age of Taurus? Was it 4,000?
So what I have is 5,000 BC to 2,000 BC.
Yeah. Around
kind
4.
of really rough.
Yeah.
So the majority of the case for Bronze Age Atlantis actually comes from Plato's description of Athens in the Critias dialogue. The Critias dialogue. So I might have talked about this a little bit in the first episode. The Timaeus is kind of just a summary, and the Critias is unfinished. What is finished of the Critias is a description of Athens and a description of Atlantis. The description of Atlantis gets a lot of attention, but not always the description of Athens. The description of Athens has some interesting stuff in it, though, that corresponds in a lot of ways to Mycenaean Greece. So we're going to go through a lot of the description of Athens and Critias, not 100% of it, but the majority of it. But so unlike the Timaeus one, I mean, so when we did the last episode, Timaeus, I read through basically the whole Atlantis summary of that.
Yeah.
I'm skipping around in a lot of places in Critias just because Critias is a larger dialogue and we wouldn't have time to read all of it.
Okay.
Plus, we got to get to a lot of non-Plato stuff with the sea people. So we have limited time, but I would encourage everybody to read Critias on their own just to kind of see how this all fits in. So,
all right. Well, hey,
Critias.
let's take a break before we get into that.
Yep.
Sounds good.
We're about up. Yeah, you're running out of time already, buddy.
No, that's beautiful. This is a perfect breaking point.
All right.
All right.
We'll be right back.
And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, Brothers of the Serpent podcast, here with Tony Petrangelo of the Snakeforce.
That's right.
Welcome back to the show, buddy. And yeah, pretty good arguments so far. I have a question for you pertaining to the idea of Atlantis. Do you believe in the possibility of an advanced civilization pre-end of the Ice Age? Or is this particularly about the idea of Atlantis and Plato's Atlantis?
I think Atlantis is a red herring for that idea.
Right.
I think there probably was civilization during the Ice Age. It doesn't make sense necessarily that there wouldn't be, that people would have been around for that long and not have figured out civilization by that point. I just think Atlantis is a little bit of a red herring in that regard.
Okay, question number 2.
Okay.
Do you think that the ancient people have some memory of that civilization that they talk about in the ancient texts? Like that some of these legends of people that came before and destructions of the world pertain to the end of the last Ice Age?
It's entirely possible. I know there are also a lot of destructions after the last Ice Age.
Yeah,
too.
that's right.
So, that's just the question is like, how far back does the stories go? They certainly could go back that far, but we know also there was more than likely a Black Sea flood event that happened even before the Bronze Age, which would have been fairly catastrophic as well. So, there was a lot of destructive events in the past. And obviously the end of the Ice Age itself was a hugely destructive event, and the Younger Dryas was a hugely destructive event. So yeah, it's like human history is littered with catastrophe.
Yep.
It's just, yeah, the question, yeah, that's what you just asked is like, the $64,000 question, I guess, is which stories are from what time? Like, I don't know.
All right.
I just think Atlantis is Bronze Age is my take.
But just specifically Atlantis, that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't an advanced civilization previous to that. That's the idea.
I suspect it seems like there was probably advanced, what you want to call advanced, but there was civilization on the coast of the Black Sea when that flooded, because there seems to be a kind of diaspora that spreads from that area after that time.
Yeah.
I don't know, and then once you go back even further, you're getting into, some pretty deep time. So it's hard to know, how long some of this stuff can last. But some of these myths, if Martin Sweatman's right, then a lot of this stuff does go back, 10,000 years, 9,000 years.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's a matter of, what dots you're going to connect to what stories, I suppose.
Yep.
There's certainly a lot of evidence of myths that go way back. And then just the question is, what's the original myth, I guess, right? Like what's the original story?
The original monomyth.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think Deucalion's a good example of that because it has a lot of elements that are like the classical flood myth, but it also, if you believe the Greek placing of it, happened way, way later than, or I guess earlier, way, way after, the big flood would have happened. So,
definitely happened after the flood of Utnapishtim and.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the Plato dialogues, it seems like whichever stance you want to take, you have to take certain aspects of the dialogue for granted, or just say, well, they're talking about Athens that they were aware of at that time, or they're talking about warfare equipment that they were aware of at that time, trying to explain something in the past. Or if you're on the side of Bronze Age Atlantis, you have to say, well, they're just throwing out these dates to say our civilization is really old. And
yeah,
well, no, you're right, because there are anachronisms also. Plato at one point describes Atlantis as being in possession of triremes, which, as far as we know, only came about, like, the Athenians invented them in like the 400s BC or the 500s BC.
Yeah.
So that would have, like, Homer has a lot of these anachronisms where it's like Bronze Age stuff mixed with Iron Age stuff. Elements got added as the story kind of progressed and people added elements. So yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. It's how you're going to read the story. I'm not trying to belittle anybody's Ice Age take. I think those are perfectly valid takes.
You're taking a hairdryer to my Ice Age take, buddy.
I just have a different take, that's all.
Well, I think that some of that might be because of the nature of oral tradition. One of the things about oral tradition is that as it's passed on, they don't change the nature of the story, but they may update objects in the story to make sense to the people they're talking to. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So when they're talking about triremes, what they meant was like the most advanced ships we've got.
Yep.
So I don't know.
Yep. No. Yeah. Exactly. That's probably what he meant.
Yeah.
I mean, he probably didn't literally mean triremes.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. We're just dealing with. I mean, and again, that could even be a mistranslation thing. Maybe he didn't use triremes, but it got translated. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know enough about the Greek language to know about that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
we're dealing with a lot of different levels of, Plato too. I think it's pretty clear he built multiple levels into his dialogues too. So it's just kind of, yeah. I mean, there's 80 million ways to interpret this thing. And that's what's great about it. Everybody can have their own take.
Yep.
There's only one correct take.
Yeah. Yep. And this is the Tony take right now.
That's right.
No, I mean, actually, most of this Bronze Age stuff isn't like my stuff. I got this from other people. So, but it's just a synthesis of a lot of different stuff I've read. So, all right. So just getting back to Athens now. So this is pretty much from here out. We're going to just be talking a lot about Athens. Well, not here out, but for this segment here, we're going to be talking a lot about Athens. So this is from Critias. Now, different gods had their allotments in different places, which they set in order. Hephaestus and Athene, who were brother and sister and sprang from the same father, having a common nature and being united also in the love of philosophy and art, both obtained their common portion this land, which was naturally adapted for wisdom and virtue, and there they implanted brave children of the soil, and put into their minds the order of government. Their names are preserved, but their actions have disappeared for reason of the destruction of those who received the tradition and the lapse of ages. For when there were any survivors, as I have already said, they were men who dwelt in the mountains, and they were ignorant of the art of writing, and that heard only the names of the chiefs of the land, and very little about their actions. So there's a couple things here. One thing we'll get back to in just a minute is the implanted brave children of the soil. And this is a theme in a lot of kind of ancient people's tellings of their own stories, specifically in Greek telling of their own stories. And it's the Greeks will call it a takthen, which is essentially essentially born of the earth is what it literally means. So we'll get back to that. But some of the first kings of Athens are described as being takthen's. And so this is, here Athene is talking about implanting brave children of the soil. We'll get back to that in a minute, though, when they bring that up. The thing we're going to talk about right now is the art of writing. They were ignorant of the art of writing. And then if we go back to Timaeus, there's a section where he says, in the first place, you remember a single deluge only, but there were many previous ones. In the next place, you do not know that there formerly dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, and that you and your whole city are descended from a small seed or remnant of them which survived. And this was unknown to you because for many generations The survivors of that destruction died, leaving no written word. So the Mycenaean Greeks had a written word that was lost for thousands of years. So the Linear B tablets were first excavated by Arthur Evans when he excavated Knossos on Crete. And then more caches were found. A big one was found in Pylos on mainland Greece, and they've been found elsewhere. It wasn't actually deciphered until 1952 when an architect, Michael Ventris, deciphered the script, proving that it was actually an archaic form of Greek. But there was no reason Plato would have known anything about Linear B. And there's no reason to suggest that anybody knew anything about Linear B after it had died out until it was rediscovered. So this is just Plato talking about leaving no written word fits the Mycenaeans having lost the written word, Linear B. And then the archaic Greeks end up picking up the alphabet from the Phoenicians around 800 BC as like the first evidence of the Greeks using the alphabet. So this is where we get back to the names, back to Critias. The names they were willing enough to give to their children, but the virtues and laws of their predecessors they knew only by obscure traditions. And as they themselves and their children lacked for many generations the necessities of life, they directed their attention to the supply of their wants. And of them they conveyed to the neglect of events that had happened in times long past. For mythology and the inquiry into antiquity are the first introduced into cities when they begin to have leisure, and when they see that the necessities of life have already been provided, but not before. And this is the reason why the names of the ancients have been preserved for us, but not their actions. This I infer because Solon said that the priests in their narrative of that war mentioned most of the names which are recorded prior to the time of Theseus, such as Cecrops, Erysichthon, Erythanius, and Erythesis. I'm trying to make sure I got those pronunciations right.
That sounds good to
this
me.
last one, it says on the screen, if you're watching it at home, it says a different name than the Erythesis. And that's it's the same person who gets called a different name in different parts of Greek mythology, as far as I could tell. But so these five people, Theseus specifically is like, I guess you could say Cyclops would be like the George Washington of Athens, and Theseus would be like the Abraham Lincoln of Athens. Okay. Not to get politics involved or anything. Yeah. But like Cyclops was like the first king, founder of Athens. And Theseus was like a sort of pivotal figure in Athenian history. He was the one who there's this myth about Minos having a tribute where the Athenians would have to give him a tribute of 7 virgin boys and 7 virgin girls every year. And Theseus was the one who went to Crete and killed the Minotaur and freed Athens of the tribute, and brought back the ring of Minos, or I don't remember exactly how the myth goes. But Theseus is a very pivotal player in Athenian history. The way it's worded here, this I infer because Solon said the priests in their narrative of the war mentioned most of the names which are recorded prior to the time of Theseus, such as Cyclops. It's unclear to me whether he's including Theseus in the list of names or whether he's just using Theseus as a demarker name. Like,
it's a marker of time. Yeah,
exactly. So it's unclear whether Theseus is meant to be included or Theseus is just a demarker. It could be read either way, I think. But either, I mean, no matter how you're going to do it, essentially these are all sort of historical mythological kings of Athens.
Okay.
So, they begin with Athenian history beginning in like 1581 BC. And here's some pictures. So Cyclops is this guy over here who's half man, half serpent.
All right.
And most of the Autochthians are depicted as being half man, half serpent. It's an interesting Brothers of the Serpent thing. And then here's Theseus killing the Minotaur. It's a pretty sweet sculpture, so I put that on there.
Oh, yeah.
So
he's using a club.
Go ahead.
He's got a club. Looks like a stick. Yep.
Yeah. It's a club. There's all sorts of different versions about like how he actually killed the Minotaur. He essentially offered himself as a tribute.
Yeah.
To go to Crete. And then once he was there, got help from somebody. It was Minos' daughter.
Classic Greek sculpture. He's like, I'm going to go in here wearing only a helmet.
And an arm flap.
So a lot of Greek statues are depicted with, balls out like that.
Clubs and arm flaps. Yeah.
It's just all you need is a helmet. And you're good to go.
Yeah. But yeah, so some of those Erysichthon was actually the son of Cecrops. He died during his father's reign, but Erycthonius was actually a fairly pivotal Athenian king. He supposedly was the first one to teach Athenians how to yoke horses, to tie them together to use 2 horses to drive a chariot. Theseus has a bunch of events associated with him in the Parian marble, most of them dealing with Demeter and the illusion mysteries, which was something I didn't bring up in the last episode, but is a whole nother rabbit hole to go down as far as Plato is the illusion mysteries. If you're familiar with the book that Graham Hancock's been promoting recently, written by Brian Miskeroo, The Immortality Key, that deals a lot with the Elysian mysteries. Yeah. That's a whole nother rabbit hole, which doesn't really play a whole lot into Bronze Age Atlantis, but is certainly an interesting thing to look into. So getting back to Critias now, he goes on to say, moreover, since military pursuits were common to men and women, men in those days, in accordance with the custom of the time, set up a figurine and image of the goddess in full armor to be a testimony that all animals which associate together, male as well as female, may, if they please, practice in common the virtue which belongs to them without distinction of sex. Now, military pursuits being in common to men and women is certainly not a thing that was true of the Mycenaean Greeks.
Yeah.
But it is something that Plato brings up in his lead into the story of Atlantis in the Timaeus. He talks about all these aspects of the ideal state.
Right,
one of them was the equality of men and women in military pursuit. So this can certainly be seen as something that Plato is just adding to the Athenians of the time to make them conform with his ideal state that he's trying to present. I don't think there was, unless you look at maybe the Amazons, but even then the Amazons weren't depicted as being necessarily equal between men and women, but it was more a female dominated society.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that there is any sort of parallel for military pursuits being common to men and women in the Bronze Age. But I don't necessarily know if you can really point to that being a thing. It's certainly still controversial in this modern day and age. So
yeah. But the idea is that if he's talking about some far more ancient civilization that we've forgotten about, he's claiming basically that it was common then. Is that the idea?
Well, this was also something, though, again, in Timaeus, when he kind of goes through, he sums up like these were the things we talked about the previous day about the ideal state.
Yeah.
Well, this was one of the things he specifically brings up, that the military pursuits were equal to men and women.
Yeah.
So it could be that this was part of some ancient civilization. To me, it just seems like a Platonic addition.
Okay.
Social stratification. This is also a thing he talks about. So now the country was inhabited in those days by various classes of citizens. There were artisans, there were husbandmen, there were also a warrior class originally set apart by divine men. The latter dwelt by themselves and had all things suitable for nature, nurture, and education. Neither had any of them anything of their own, but they regarded all that they had as a common property. Nor did they claim to receive of the other citizens anything more than their necessary food. And they practiced all the pursuits which we yesterday described as those of our imaginary guardians. So again, this is a thing that Plato specifically calls out for the ideal state, that they would have essentially socialist warrior class, right? Like they would share everything amongst themselves.
Yeah, no possessions.
And they would also be a stratification of citizens into different, groups of jobs and things like that.
And these classes were originally built by divine men. That's...
He's specifically talking about the warrior class was set apart by divine men. Either way, talking about right. the delineations being made by divine men. So this is something Plato specifically again talks about in his defining what an ideal city would be.
Yeah, that's kind of the way. That's still kind of the way it's done. With the army or the military,
they don't have their own possessions.
They all go in and they're everybody's given the same stuff and. whatever your rank is, you're treated the same. It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
I mean, and that just depends at the time. So the Mycenaeans, as they were depicted by Homer, that certainly wasn't the case. They would go to a place, they would raid and plunder it, and then the spoils would get divided however the particular leader saw fit at that time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was equally, sometimes certain people got more, some people, it was all up to whoever was like the leader of that particular.
Yeah, I think he's talking about modern military, like people join
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, obviously when you go home, you have your possessions at home and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, when you go into, like, you get recruited and you go into like base camp or whatever.
They're like, here's your pants, here's your shirt, here's your underwear.
Everybody wears the same
boots.
clothes. They all look the same. They all are treated the same, of the same rank and all that kind of stuff. You're given the same food.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, like, what Plato would have known about the Greeks of that time was probably what Homer and Hesiod and then maybe a few other people like that wrote. And the Greeks in Homer are certainly not, you wouldn't describe them as in this way at all.
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, again, so I guess the point here is not necessarily that this proves anything, because again, this is something that Plato specifically says the ideal state should have this particular layout.
Yeah.
The Mycenaeans themselves were also divided into like a social stratification where they had, it was a very kind of delineated society, and that's what the Linear B tablets show. But that's not necessarily what Homer depicted at all. So Plato wouldn't have had any knowledge of that. But again, this is something that Plato has as part of his ideal state.
The other way you could look at it is that if he really did get this information from his ancestors about Atlantis, that was the seed for his ideal state. So that when he's describing the ideal state in other texts, he's actually referring to what he learned about the idea of Atlantis from his ancestors. I mean, how do you know which one it is, right?
I mean, it's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the social stratification thing isn't necessarily meant to be anything other than I'm just kind of going through most of the aspects of Athens that are talked about in the Critias.
Yeah, I agree. I know that. I was just thinking of the side because the last episode we also talked about, I mean, that's one of the common arguments is that his description of Atlantis is really just him describing the ideal state, right?
Yeah.
I'm making a separate point.
Well, but so Atlantis isn't the ideal state, though. Atlantis is the one who goes to war. Athens of the story is the ideal state.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
right.
And this
that's
is
what I meant.
And this is what I'm getting at here is some of these descriptions of Athens don't fit the Mycenaeans, but they fit the ideal state that Plato was describing. So I think it's like he's taking elements of his ideal state and he's grafting them onto the story he has.
Agreed. I'm trying. I got that wrong. You're right. It was Athens, but I'm just saying that if he really did learn of that entire story of ancient times from his ancestors, maybe that's where he got the idea.
That's the source of the idea.
The source of the idea for the ideal state.
Yeah.
No, that's entirely possible. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm not discounting that. That's certainly a possibility for sure. So next he gets onto the extraordinary inundation. Now the city in those days was arranged on this wise. In the first place, the Acropolis was not as now. For the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rock. At the same time, there were earthquakes, and then occurred the extraordinary inundation, which was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion. So we already talked about this.
Yeah.
But this is just getting back to, because this is part of the description that it's kind of in the flow of what he's talking about with Athens. Athens itself, there isn't necessarily evidence of a huge flood. There is evidence of a huge flood in the Peloponnese, specifically in Tiryns. And this here I'm going to read is from a paper called Landscape Changes Around Tiryns During the Bronze Age. Its remains are today buried by up to 6 meters of sediment. Late in early Helladic II, a stream south of Tiryns accumulated several meters of gravel and floodplain deposits. In late Helladic III BC, and late Helladic II, III, these are all pottery sequences, and we'll get into this a little bit.
Okay. All right.
Maybe I was supposed to get into this earlier. We can get into this a little bit later, but late Helladic III, late Helladic II BC, these are Mycenaean pottery sequences.
Okay.
So like for the Hittites and the Egyptians, they have kings lists. They don't have any of that for the Mycenaeans.
Yeah.
So they date everything with pottery sequences. In late Helladic III BC, this stream abandoned its bed and shifted to the north of the Tiryns Knoll. At the same time, it deposited up to 4 inches of coarse alluvium in the eastern parts of the palatial lower town. This depositional event may have coincided with the destruction phase in the archaeological record of Tiryns. And then later on in the paper, if, however, an earthquake did occur at Tiryns that was sufficiently strong to topple all the buildings on the lower citadel, it may also have caused a flash flood that resulted in the deposition of several meters of coarse alluvium in the lower town. Such a simultaneous occurrence of earthquakes and floods is very common. Some of the most devastating inundations in the history of the world have been earthquake-induced.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of diagram on here that shows the kind of progression where Tiryns kind of had developed to the north of a river, and then at some point the river gets diverted directly through the town, and then they kind of rebuilt the town to the south of the river, and then they built a dam to just completely change the course of the river entirely. So that's the progression that's shown in these three images here. But that's, again, there's evidence of major flooding at the ends of the Bronze Age in Greece.
6 meters of sediment. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, essentially a river got diverted into Tiryns.
Yeah.
Which would have been a lot of water coming their way.
Yeah.
But this occurred at the same time. There was a lot of earthquakes. Mycenae is very close to Tiryns, so that could have also been affected by this.
Yep.
So yeah.
And I remember the description that in Timaeus, the description that the Egyptian priest gives to Solon is that the Athenian fighters were swallowed up by the earth, is what he said. Which was an interesting description. That they
Yeah, and it was also unclear in that whether he was trying to say the Athenian fighters were in Atlantis when that happened,
right?
Because all he says was that that the catastrophe occurred after the war.
Yeah,
but he doesn't say how long after, so it's unclear whether the Athenians were in Atlantis at the time, or were not in Athens at the time.
Yeah.
But he does also say that Athens was also affected by the same catastrophe. So.
Right. It sounded to me, because of the way he describes Atlantis disappearing beneath the waves versus the Athenians being swallowed up by the earth, that he was implying they were in different places. But being swallowed by the earth was just
it's hard to know. Yeah, I mean, if you follow his directions, that seems to point outside the Pillars of Hercules, so they would have been outside of the Straits of Gibraltar, so they would have been in different places.
Yeah.
So I mean,
mudslide,
depending on where you think the Pillars of Hercules were, I guess.
Yeah.
So back to Critias. So he's talking about the Cyclopean Wall now. So outside the Acropolis, under the sides of the hill, there dwelt artisans and such of the husbandmen as were tilling the ground near. The warrior class dwelt by themselves around the temples of Athene and Hephaestus at the summit, which moreover they had enclosed with a single fence like the garden of a single house. So the Acropolis, the Mycenaeans built a giant defensive wall around the Acropolis that in later times was referred to as the Cyclopean Wall. And it wasn't just in Athens that this happened, and we'll kind of get into some of the other sites this happened in a minute here. But there was an existing wall, and then towards the end of the Bronze Age, they rebuilt it and fortified it. So it's unclear when the first wall was built, but it definitely seems like there was a rebuilding reconfiguration that happened at the ends of the Bronze Age, and they think it happened at the end of the Bronze Age because there was pottery fragments found in the fill of the parts of the wall that were constructed later that have pottery that dates to the same time as the end of the Bronze Age. It also dates to some of the pottery found in a fountain, which we'll get to in a minute.
How old was the wall initially? Do they know that? Do they have any idea?
I mean, I don't know if I've seen dating on that.
Yeah.
So I guess I don't want to speculate.
Fine. Yep, no problem.
So the Acropolis itself is 350 meters long and 170 meters wide at the longest and the widest points. So it's an approximate circumference of 800 meters that they built this wall. And there's a kind of diagram of the wall on the screen right now. But the Acropolis, it's kind of like a bean shape, so it's not necessarily it doesn't follow a bean. There's some kind of curvatures and stuff like that, but it's not like a circle. So and there's a lot of little like areas where there would have been some kind of tricky places.
It's not square and it's not round. It's like a strange shape. Yeah.
And so too, if you see, there's on the north side of the Acropolis, there's like you can kind of see there's like a little path that leads up.
Yeah, I see it.
And then there's a gate here. So that gate got closed up when they rebuilt the wall at the end of the Bronze Age, when they did the fortifications, so that they limited to just a single gate. So there was initially two gates, They completely closed one up when they did the rebuilding. But so here Plato again is referring to though that they had enclosed the Acropolis with a single fence.
He calls that a fence?
That's the translation. It's called, I'm using the Jowett translation, so I'm just sticking with that.
Yeah.
In other translations, it's referred to as other things. Okay. So the warriors' houses on the north side, they had dwellings in common and had erected halls for dining in winter and had all the buildings which they needed for their common life besides temples. But there was no adorning of them with gold and silver, for they made no use of these for any purpose. They took a middle course between meanness and ostentation and built modest houses in which they and their children's children grew old. And they handed them down to others who were like themselves, always the same. But in summertime, they left their gardens and gymnasia and dining halls, and then the southern side of the hill was made use of by them for the same purpose. So there's not necessarily any evidence of this north side, south side changing spring and summer occupation. We do know, though, that the Mycenaean buildings, to the degree that there was a palace on the Acropolis in Mycenaean times, it was on the north side, which is where Plato's saying that the dwellings were. Some stuff I've read interprets these Mycenaean houses. If you look at the map that I'm showing, there's a arrow pointing to Mycenaean houses that are on the side of the Acropolis. Some people interpret that some stuff I've read interprets that as the houses, but Bronier, who's the main excavator here, Oscar Bronier, and this is where I'm getting a lot of these pictures and the descriptions of the archaeological stuff from. His descriptions of those houses don't make it sound like they're warriors' houses at all.
Okay.
So,
those houses are on the outside of the defensive wall.
They're on the outside of the defensive wall. Yeah. I'll read what he wrote about it, and I'll give you my take on it. Okay. So Bernier wrote, in addition to the main approach from the west, there was a postern gate communicating with the north and east slopes of the hill. The early foundations of this part of the Acropolis indicate the existence of towers flanking a single opening, which was approached by a path with flights of steps inserted where the incline was steepest. 2 periods of construction are indicated. Okay, here it says actually, the first of which may be as early as the 15th century BC. In the final phase of the fortification, to which we shall presently return, the gate was closed and the path and stairs outside the wall became buried under small, poorly constructed houses. At a later time, these dwellings were abandoned, apparently as a result of a sudden threat to the city, and the inhabitants presumably took refuge within the walls. The pottery left standing on the floors as they fled from their houses shows that this took place in the last quarter of the 13th century BC. Whatever caused the sudden abandonment of the North Slope settlement, the houses were never again rebuilt. So poorly constructed houses near a construction site sound to me like the workers' houses, the people who were building the wall.
Yeah.
That's what they built to live in while they were doing the construction. They were near this postern gate, so they probably were using that as getting into the place while they were building it. And then the last thing they did was close up the gate and leave, and then just leave the poorly built houses to disintegrate on site.
Yeah.
That's my take on that. I've read some stuff, though, that interprets those Mycenaean houses as being what Plato's talking about. I don't think that's the case. And especially since there is evidence that the Mycenaean palace was built on the north side. So, I mean, that's, to me, that seems like a much more logical place to have as your warriors' housing than these small little poorly constructed houses on the north side.
Yeah, on the outside of the wall. Yeah.
On the outside of the wall, exactly.
Right.
So here's where we get to the fountain. So this is again from Critias, where the Acropolis now is, there was a fountain which was choked by the earthquake and has left only the few small streams which still exist in the vicinity. But in those days, the fountain gave an abundant supply of water for all and of suitable temperature in summer and in winter. So there's some diagrams I have on here of the actual fountain that the Mycenaeans constructed. And it's essentially 40 meters straight down a cleft inside the Acropolis wall rock itself.
Wow.
So I'll just kind of read some of Bronier's excavation notes because he was kind of impressed by it. But so the most important result of the excavation was wholly unexpected: the discovery of a Mycenaean stairway leading from the Acropolis through the cleft in the rock to a copious underground water supply at a depth of 40 meters below the Acropolis level. So it is obvious that the problem of construction taxed the mechanical ingenuity of the builders to its limit. The result was not altogether successful. They were probably both familiar with wooden ladders and with ordinary stairs, but difficulties arose in trying to adapt these types of construction to a steep underground chasm where wood was likely to rot and the surface of the rock was too steep to provide support for stone foundations. So they essentially cut like
Yeah, I see
divots
it.
into the stone wall where they could build out these wooden steps that were supported by this stone like lattice structure. It's pretty crazy what they did, going 40 meters down, and then it ends at essentially a spot where they lower a bucket in to get the water. So
Wow.
they don't even go down all the way to the water. They have to lower the bucket like another, I think 100 feet down to the actual water level in order to get the water.
Yeah, because looking at that last bit before the water, that would be the most dangerous part right there.
Yeah, this is essentially this bit here is where they're like dropping the line down, right?
Yeah.
there
That
to
is
get the
amazing.
water.
Yeah, that is amazing.
That would have been awesome to find. Holy
Yeah.
Yeah, so his excavation report is actually really interesting. It's actually mostly concerned with pottery because this whole thing was just filled with pottery.
Oh my gosh.
Apparently after this, and so I can get to this here real quick and then we can talk about that. So the nature of the construction with wooden beams used for reinforcements indicate that the fountain was made in haste to meet an emergency. The builders must have known that the timber would soon decay in the damp underground descent. When the wooden framework gave way, the stairway crashed down and the debris filled much of the shaft. It is possible that an earthquake hastened the destruction, but severe earthquakes are not common in Athens and the stairway itself cannot in any case have outlasted the wooden reinforcement. I don't know what he's saying. Severe earthquakes are not common in Athens. I mean, earthquakes themselves are common all over the Aegean.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily know what that's all about. But he's essentially saying like it's possible an earthquake destroyed the stairwell. It probably would have collapsed within a few hundred years or within 100 years anyways, just because of the construction techniques used.
Yeah.
But he's basically saying again, this is going back to a lot of books I've read seem fairly certain that Oscar Bronier is saying that an earthquake destroyed the stairwell. He's much more, circumspect about that. He just basically says it's possible an earthquake did it.
Right.
But it's also possible it did, and that's the tradition that Plato's passing along. Is
But
an
why
earthquake destroyed
why
the
was it
fountain.
full of pottery? It
So after the theory is it's all later pottery after the Bronze Age. So the idea would be after the stairway collapse, they just use it as a dump.
Oh, okay. Wow. All right, well, we got to take another break. Man.
Sounds good.
Okay. We'll be back. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Second hour of the show. And we have no degrees, only certificates of ignorance here, but Tony is teaching us a lot of stuff here. It's very interesting. I'm still not sure I'm buying the Bronze Age stuff, but this is good stuff.
I'm starting to buy it.
Oh, yeah? Starting to buy it? All right, where are we going next, Tony?
Well, so okay, I just got done talking about the fountain.
Yep.
That was built in the Acropolis of Athens, and so that happened. The wall around the Acropolis got fortified at that same time, and Bronier had mentioned in his excavation report that just based on the level of engineering that went into the fountain, that it was very important, and based on the workmanship, it was probably built in an emergency. Like they needed to get this done right away. Similar stuff was going on elsewhere in the Mycenaean world. So this is also from Bronier's report, Mycenaean Fountain on the Athenian Acropolis. And he says, Mycenae offers one of the best examples of the engineers' ingenuity in meeting this problem. And this is the problem of protecting the water from invaders. The spring from which the city received its supply was at some distance from the Acropolis and separated from it by a ravine. In the earlier period, while the lords of Mycenae felt secure in the knowledge of their military strength, it was sufficient to pipe the water within convenient reach from the citadel and to provide communications through a small postern gate in the wall opposite the open fountain. But such an arrangement would be of no use in a time of siege, nor could water be stored in sufficient quantities for the needs of the population housed within the walls. This would include not only the royal household with its entourage of retainers and guards, but the whole population of the city, with no other effective protection than the walls of the citadel, would doubtless take refuge at such times within the Acropolis. The engineers who built the last extension to the fortress of Mycenae made provisions for just such an emergency as this. for it was at that time that the underground stairway was built connecting the fountain directly with the citadel. And then at Tiryns, the water supply was probably in the plain at some little distance from the Acropolis, and the inhabitants of the city would have been at the mercy of an enemy who could get near enough to take possession of the fountain. When the last extension to the fortification was made, a barbican was constructed protecting the approach to the water supply, which thus became included within the fortified area of the Acropolis. Yet both at Tiryns and Mycenae, the sources of water being outside the fortification wall were not entirely free from the danger of falling into the hands of the enemy. So Mycenae also upgraded their fortification wall at the same time. They upgraded their protection of their water supply. Tiryns did this. This kind of thing was going on all over the Mycenaean world at this time. Not every single location, but a lot of the locations. But then
implying they were worried about being invaded. Is that the idea?
They were worried about something.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't do this because you're worried about earthquakes.
Well, you're not doing it because you're worried about a flood either. I mean,
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You do this because you're worried about, a siege.
Yeah.
So these are defensive fortifications. So this is from a different Brunier paper called Athens in the Late Bronze Age. The uninterrupted existence and growth of Athens from late Hellenic times into the early Iron Age contrasts remarkably with the experience of the cities in the Argolis during the same period. The major sites, Mycenae, Tiryns, Proxima, Berbere, were destroyed around 1200 BC. Many sites were abandoned, and others, a remnant of their population, stayed on or returned later. The deterioration in the quality of pottery and the works of art following the destruction is so precipitous as to indicate a serious decline in population. By comparison, Athens remained a populous center, as is shown by the number of sub-Mycenaean and proto-geometric graves. The Athenian claim to a continuous occupation of their city, repeated ad nauseum by the writers of Athens, has been shown by archaeological discoveries to be based on fact. So then this is from Timaeus. This is referring to Athens. She was preeminent in courage and military skill and was the leader of the Hellenes. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars. So again, Athens, of all of the Greek cities, and Athens wasn't the only one, but most of the Greek cities were destroyed or heavily depopulated. Athens seemingly survived somewhat intact at the end of the Bronze Age, which is similar to the way Plato tells it, where they were the ones who alone defeated the Atlantean invaders.
Yeah.
So then we get into, so that we're basically done with Athens now. So we're getting into now, what is the story that came from Egypt that Solon was passing on? So I'm just going to read this from Timaeus. Now, in this island of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire which had rule over the whole island and several others, and other parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Hercules as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyria. This vast power. That was the one thing I guess I didn't check the pronunciation on, was Tyria. This vast power gathered into one, endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours and the whole of the region within the straits. So this is from the Medinet Habu inscription in Egypt. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Azara, and Alicia on, being cut off one at a time. A camp was set up in Amaru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which never came into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Peleset, the Tejeker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. So these are describing similar things. Timaeus is describing an empire, a vast power that gathered all of their, regional, or all of their different territories into one to subdue the region within the straits, the region where Egypt was. And the Medinet Habu inscription is describing a similar thing where, there was a conspiracy among foreign islands. They united to invade Egypt.
Yeah.
And this is the Sea Peoples. So this is the whole idea with Bronze Age Atlantis, essentially, is that the Sea Peoples is the story. The invasion of the Sea Peoples into Egypt is the story that the priests of Egypt told Solon, and that Solon brought back to Greece. So here we're just showing a map, and this is I showed this map earlier, but this is now I've highlighted all of the areas that the Egyptian priests specifically said in the Menet-Habu description that got destroyed. Okay. So Azarwa, which is Western Anatolia. Azarwa figures a lot into Hittite history, and Azarwa was an area that the Hittites and the Ahiawans, the Mycenaean Greeks, fought over a lot. But that's one of the areas that the is listed as being destroyed. Hatti, which is the Hittites. Alicia, the island of Cyprus. Amuru, which is a kingdom in northern Syria. Carchemish, which is on the Euphrates. And then Code is in this map called Tarsha. But Tarsha was what the Hittites called it. Code was what the Egyptians called it.
Okay.
So if you're looking at the screen, there's a carving over on the left, and this is just one of the sea peoples from the Menet-Habu inscription. But we'll get into a lot of these depictions of sea peoples here in just a minute. And then I've also put on the map, this is from 1177 BC, of all the cities that got destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. And just to kind of show that correlation to the degree that there is one. Mentions of the sea peoples groups. So that the thing I just read from was a Menet-Habu inscription, which is from the second invasion of the sea peoples in 1177 BC. But the sea peoples are kind of around the periphery of the Mediterranean for a while before that. So the Luca, which is one of the members of the first coalition that invades Egypt, they're mentioned as far back as like 1850-ish in what's known as the Byblos obelisk. And this is just a person referred to as the son of Luca. Not really that big of a deal, but it's just these groups are mentioned back a ways. In the Amarna letters, which is dated anywhere between 1400 and 1300, just depending on the letters themselves aren't dated, so they're dated based on who is writing to who,
yes.
And trying to fit them into chronology. So there's not necessarily any firm dating on any specific letters, but both the Sheridan and the Luca are mentioned in letters. In 1280 BC, the Sheridan attack Egypt and are defeated by Egypt. And then in 1274, a few years later, there's the Battle of Kadesh and I'm going to get into a lot of this stuff in more detail. I'm just kind of going through kind of a broad outline.
Okay.
There's the Battle of Kadesh between the Egyptians and the Hittites, which is one of the biggest battles of the late Bronze Age. And in this battle, the Sheridan are working as mercenaries for the Egyptians, or the Egyptians capture them as prisoners and have them working as mercenaries, however that relationship worked. And then the Luca are actually allied with the Hittites for this. And then a while later, you get the first Sea Peoples invasion. And this is the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Luca, the Sheridan, the Shekelesh, all allied with the Libyans invading Egypt. And then after that, there's letters. There's a few different letters from and to. So there's a letter from Ugarit. There's a letter from Hatti. Dating these specific letters, again, for the same reason as the Amarna letters, is it's hard to get a specific date for them. You can kind of put them in relationship with maybe who it was from and who it was to and when those kings reigned, but you can't necessarily define it to a specific date.
Yeah.
But there's a letter from the king of Ugarit that mentions that all of his ships are in the land of Luca. And then there's a letter from the king of Hatti who's requesting extradition of someone who is a prisoner of the Shekelesh. And then there's the second Sea Peoples invasion. This is the Pleset, the Tjeker, the Sheridan, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. I'm throwing a lot of names out there. We're going to go through all these. Don't worry. And then after that invasion, the Sheridan, the Tjeker, and the Pleset are indicated as settling in Canaan. The Egyptian inscriptions say that they settled them in Canaan as
that the pharaoh defeated
forces
them
of their strongholds.
Yeah.
But the later Egyptian texts seem to think that seem to indicate that those lands are now out of Egyptian control.
Yeah.
So whether the Egyptians settled them or that was just where they settled is, kind of a question.
Yeah, the text.
But then
the text implies that the pharaoh defeated them and then settled the survivors in Canaan.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even though later you find out that those lands aren't considered under Egyptian control, so it's more like the pharaoh's just those people escaped in that direction and settled there. But he tried to say that he did it, Yeah, I made them do that.
The Bronze Age collapse does a number on all these civilizations, and the Egyptians don't collapse, but they certainly never really reached the height that they had before.
Yeah, yep.
So yeah, their ability to enforce their empire basically goes away after.
Yeah, that's true. You're right. That's true. Yep.
And then even as late as like the 1060s, the Shurden are mentioned as mercenaries working for the Egyptians in Egyptian documents. So we'll just go through some of this stuff. So this here over here is pictured. That's the Byblos obelisk that mentions the son of Luca. This over here on the right is below that is an Amarna letter, and I actually don't know specifically which one that is. It's just an example of what they look like.
Okay. Cuneiform tablet. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is all written in Assyrian. All the Amarna letters are written in Assyrian. The stuff in Ugarit is written in like up to 8 different languages because Ugarit was like a just international port city of the time. All these different cultures were all using it to trade with all each other. So that there was all sorts of languages found in Ugarit. Hatti had, I think, Luwian as well as Assyrian. A few different languages found there. So it's just each region had its own sort of. In Egypt, like it seems like all of their internal documents were probably written on papyrus. So how much of those have survived or not. Whereas a lot of these like diplomatic documents seem to have been written on clay tablets. So there seems to be different methods of communication that were going on depending on who you were communicating with.
Yeah, and the clay tablets survive better than papyrus.
Yeah, well, too, in the case of like the linear B tablets, those weren't baked at the time. They seem to have been like washed and reused. So the only linear B tablets that are extant are essentially from like the last year to a few months of the palace. And those only are survived because they got baked in the fire.
Baked in the fire, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, and that's the thing with the problem with linear B is you don't necessarily have, and nobody's ever found, as far as we know, like an archive or a diplomatic cache.
Oh, yeah.
It's all just like,
Random.
Real rudimentary like inventories of goods and stuff that they're like manufacturing. And then also like, sacrifices to gods, inventories of sacrifices to gods and stuff like that. So as far as the Amarna letters, the Shurden I mentioned, the Amarna letters, it's mainly the king of Byblos, this guy named Ribhada. He wrote the majority of the Amarna letters. He was writing to the pharaoh all the time, bugging him about stuff. But they come up a couple times in letters he wrote. So the Shurden, as far back as 1400 to 1300, were in Canaan. Whether they're from there or they were acting as Egyptian mercenaries this far back is uncertain. But they were in the Levant as far back as that. The Luca in an Amarna letter, which we'll get to in a little bit, are mentioned as raiding Cyprus. And so this is a letter that, again, this is the one that the king of Cyprus wrote to the Akhenaten, talking about the Luca. And when we talk about the Luca more, we can get into that. And then in 1230, the Shurden attack Egypt and are defeated. So the Egyptians describe him as the unruly Shurden whom no one had ever known how to combat. They came boldly sailing in their warships from the midst of the sea, none being able to withstand them. In this case, the Egyptians defeated them and then incorporated them into their army for the Battle of Kadesh. So these pictures here on the left are Egyptian depictions of Shurden. So you see they have this distinctive horned helmet with the disc in the middle.
Yeah.
That's the cable antenna or something, right? The TV antenna.
Yep. So some of these Shurdens, some of them over here don't have the disc, and some of them do.
Yeah, but they're all horned. Yeah, I see.
It's thought that the Shurden with the disc are the ones working for the Egyptians, and the Shurden without the disc are the ones who aren't working for the Egyptians. But this is all just conjecture. But they have the horns, they have the disc, they have the long swords, and they have the round shields. A lot of this will kind of play into like identifications of the groups as we go. But as far as the Battle of Kadesh, so the Egyptian inscription describing that is, now His Majesty has made ready his infantry and his chariotry, and the Shurden of His Majesty's capturing, whom he had brought back by the victory of his strong arm, supplied with all their weapons and the plan of fighting having been given to them. And then later on, His Majesty arrived at the town of Kadesh, and now the wretched fallen one of Kadesh was come and had collected together all the foreign countries as far as the end of the sea. The entire land of Kati was come, that of Narin, likewise that of Azara, Dardani, that of Karkisha, Luca, Kizwanda, Karkamish, Ugarit, Keti, the entire land of Nakashi, Mushanet, Kadesh. So Luca is there mentioned as ally of the Hittites. The Shurden mentioned as ally of the Egyptians in the big battle of Kadesh, which was, again, like the big war between the two main powers of the late Bronze Age. After this happened in about 1260, the Egyptians and the Hittites will hammer out a truce, or essentially a truce, a peace agreement. And this is like, there's exact copies of this that have been found both in Hattusa and in Egypt. So they exchanged copies of this agreement that they had kind of hammered out. So after this, we get to the first Sea Peoples invasion. So the first Sea Peoples invasion happens in 1207. And all of these dates, it should be clear, all of these dates are based on the Egyptian records. So for all of this stuff, like the first Sea Peoples invasion is referred to as happening in, I believe it's referred to as happening in the 5th year of Mereneptah. So they don't give a date, but they give like the 5th year of this pharaoh. The Ramses stuff, it's the same thing. They'll say, actually, I think it might be the 8th year of Mereneptah, and then the second one happens in the 5th year of Ramses. But that's how the Egyptians will refer to these things. So the dating is all based on when they place the reigns of those pharaohs, essentially.
Yeah.
Now, that is obviously disputable. Eric Klein, whose book I have referenced a couple times, and who it's a great book just for kind of an overview of this whole situation. But he has an anecdote that I've heard him tell where he says that, you know, he had to kind of go back and forth on the name of his book between 1177 BC and 1189 BC because the Egyptians kept changing, you know, when certain things happened or whatever.
The Egyptologists, yeah.
The Egyptologists kept changing when certain things were supposed to have happened.
Yeah.
So, you know, the dating in this whole area is like some of the sources I've read on this will list different dates for these same events. So if you happen to be reading something that has a different date for the first invasion, you know, this 1207 date is just what the current date is. That could change tomorrow.
Yeah.
So just keep in mind that, you know, none of these dates are set in stone. So the first Sea Peoples invasion, and again, Sea Peoples even too, the Egyptians never referred to the Sea Peoples, quote unquote. The Sea Peoples was a name given by a French Egyptologist, you know, back when they were first trying to figure out who the Sea Peoples were. So
yeah,
it's just a term that kind of describes this whole group of people that invaded Egypt. So this is from the Great Karnak inscription, and it says, "The wretched chief of Rebu, which is Libya, Mary, son of deity, has descended upon the foreign land of Tehanu." Tehanu is an area just to the west of Egypt, and we'll get into this when we get into the Libyans. "Together with his bowmen, Shurden, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luca, Teresh, taking the best of every fighter and every runner of his foreign land, he bringing his wife, his children," and then it goes on. So it seems like in this first invasion, it seems like it was the Libyans who were, you know, the migratory force who had hired some of these other groups to be with them. And this is just an interpretation, hired, like however that worked. But the only people who are mentioned as like bringing their wife and family are the Libyans.
Yeah.
So the rest of the groups, the Shardan, the Shekelesh, the Ekwesh, you know, they're indicated here as being brought together by the Libyans.
And they grabbed all the fighters and runners, not the women and children. Like,
the other. Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, they got a raiding force from these other. Are those like cities, or are they supposed to be countries? Are they city states?
We're going to get into that. We're going to get into that.
Right.
There's thoughts that I think the idea is they're groups of people, but then some of those groups of people give those names become place areas as well. So that gets into a whole lot of questions about like who they actually were.
Okay, yeah.
A lot of it is based on what their names sound like. So
okay.
We'll get into that though for sure. So the Meshwesh is also mentioned in a later part of this inscription, but the Meshwesh, they were actually to the west of the Libyans. And so they were probably another Libyan tribe, not necessarily, but maybe also part of the Sea Peoples. The inscription describes how Mereneptah led an expedition against the invaders, defeating them after 6 hours fighting at the border of the Nile Delta. And then a different inscription lists the number of killed the Great Karnak inscription lists the number of killed as 6,359 Libyans, 222 Shekelesh, 742 Teresh. And then a different source indicates the number of Ekwesh killed as 2,021. So clearly if you're basing like the numbers killed on representing the number of fighters that were in the group, clearly the largest number of people were the Libyans. And then the Equish maybe second. And then some of these other groups were just kind of smaller auxiliary forces, possibly.
Or the Libyans weren't very good fighters, and the other guys were better. Less of them died.
Yeah, that's possible as well.
Yeah, I don't know. But yeah,
So
if the Libyans brought families, and the Egyptians were just killing everyone in sight, then that might be why there's 6,000 of those people dead and only 222 of the fighters from another group. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, that's definitely possible. They took a number of prisoners as well, and I think they tried to take. I would have to reread the inscription exactly, but they also did take prisoners too. So
yeah.
I'm just trying. I guess it's just trying to indicate that like the Libyans seem to be
the vast majority of the group,
the main force in this particular invasion.
Yeah. It seems weird that you would. Well, I don't know. Anyway, keep going. I have questions about this whole war, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah, no, if you have questions right now, go ahead.
Well, I mean, they're not really questions for you. They're just questions in general. Like, it's like you're gonna gather up all the families in your land. You're like, okay, we're leaving. We're gonna move somewhere else, and then you're gonna go hire a bunch of mercenaries, and then you're going to invade one of the most powerful like countries in the world. What? To go find somewhere where you can move in without having to fight a giant war. It doesn't make any sense. It seems weird.
The only source we have for a lot of this stuff is the Egyptians.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Pharaonic propaganda.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were there when the people were collecting all the warriors to come fight them, right? They knew what happened.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, exactly. You know, this is the Egyptian interpretation of what happened. So.
Right.
So other mentions of the Sea Peoples groups. There's a letter from the king of Hatti, probably the last king of the Hittites, Suppilumiuma II, to the king of Ugarit, probably the last king of Ugarit, and a parallel letter from an official of Hatti that dealt with a whole range of issues. So this happened a lot of times. Two of very similar versions of the same letter would get sent, and they weren't necessarily meant for the same people. They would have sometimes been meant for different functionaries. It's hard to know exactly what was going on, but this is a case where there were two very, very similar versions of the same letter that were found. But the letter deals with a whole range of issues, but it concludes by chastising the king of Ugarit. The king of Hatti chastises him for not getting a shipment of copper to some Hayawa men who were waiting in Lucca. So Hayawa, if you notice, is very similar to Ahiyawa.
Yeah.
Ahiyawa, the name, that goes through a little bit of like early in Hittite records. The Hittites refer to the Ahiyawans as the Ahi. And then towards the end here, they're referring to them as the Hayawa. And in the middle, it's the Ahiyawans.
Huh.
So it's entirely possible that it's two different groups that at some point were sort of like united, and then, or it's just that they're referring to them by different names at different times.
Yeah.
It's unclear what's going on there, but it's just really to say that like towards the end of the Hittite Empire, they're still trying to like, you know, get copper shipments for Hawaii men who are waiting in Lucca.
Yeah.
So Lucca's a Sea Peoples group. The Hawaii men, we'll get into it, but the Mycenaeans are also thought to be part of later Sea Peoples groups. So it's just a little bit interesting. There's also a king from the letter from the king of Hatti, again, probably Suppilumiuma the second to, again, probably the last king.
What a great name, Suppilumiuma.
It is. Yes.
Suppi, how do you say it?
Suppilumiuma.
Suppilumiuma. Suppilumiuma, I think.
Yeah. It's hard to say, yeah.
It is hard to say, yes. So the second one is asking for an extradition of a Ugaritic citizen who had been held prisoner of the Shekelesh. So the people of Shikala who live on boats is how the king of Hatti refers to him as.
Yeah.
So Shikala is not Shekelesh, but it's thought that it's the same group of people essentially. And so he's, you know, it's not really explained why, but the thought is the reason why the king of Hatti would be wanting this person extradited to him is to question him about who these Shikala people were and, you know, what they wanted and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then there's a letter from the king of Ugarit, again, the last one probably, to the king of Cyprus that mentions all of his troops are in Hatti and all of his ships are in the land of Lucca. And so this one goes, my father, behold, the enemy's ships came here, my cities were burned, and they did evil things to my country. Does my father know that all my troops are in chariots are in the land of Hatti and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy came here and inflicted much damage upon us.
Yeah,
So-
and I think the whole my father thing, that's what's the deal with that? That other king is not actually his father.
Yeah, that's like diplomatic formalities,
Yeah,
and we'll get into a little bit more when I have a whole letter, a Marna letter that I'll read, and that has a little bit more about the diplomatic kind of formalities and stuff.
Yeah.
But essentially,
Or maybe
the way
that's
it's
just-
understood. So go ahead.
That's just his way of being like, my God, man, the enemy's ships are here.
Yeah,
My father, behold. That's how the
I
translator
think the way
feels
it's
it.
understood is it's like a sign of respect, and you would call someone who's maybe your equal, but of like an older generation, your father.
Yeah.
And someone who's your equal, but of your generation, your brother, and then someone who's like your equal, but of a younger generation, your son.
Okay.
It's just like the ways the kings would talk to each other in their correspondence with each
Okay,
other.
all right.
Again, this is just the way it's interpreted by the academics.
Okay.
So, to the degree that they know what's going on.
Yeah.
But so it's unclear what's going on here, but Hatti, the Hittites, were a landlocked civilization. They were, charioteers, they were horse people. So they didn't necessarily have a navy. So they depended on other like vassal states for their ships. So here's the Ugaritic king saying his ships are in the land of Luca. It's possible. It's some people think that maybe the Hittites were trying to set up a blockade, to prevent people from getting into the inner Mediterranean at this time, and that these ships maybe pass. It's unknown what happened here, but I don't know. It certainly isn't a good idea to send all your ships to some other area if you're Ugarit on the coast and you're very vulnerable to those types of attacks. So,
Yeah.
but this is towards the end of the whole thing, so things have seem to have kind of started to unravel at this point. And so then we get into trouble in Ugarit. And so as that last letter of the king of Ugarit indicates, things were not going so well with the coastal king around this time. They were doing a series of attacks that ultimately ended with the destruction of the kingdom. But it's, they seem to have been conducting trade kind of normally right up to the end, as that letter from the Hittite king telling the Ugarit king to, make sure to get the copper to the Ahiawan men kind of indicated.
Yeah.
So a letter from the king of Carchemish even says he's coming with troops to help out, and seems to be probably the last letter that was from Ugarit. But again, it's hard to know for sure when these letters date to. But this letter goes, when your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it. So
I remember hearing that. I remember hearing that. I was like, oh man, they burned the vineyards.
Yeah. Well, and it's like too, the weird thing is, like, if you're a starving migrating group of people, why would you burn the vineyards and the threshing floors?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it seems like more than that what happened with Ugarit. Like Ugarit got destroyed because people wanted to destroy Ugarit.
Yeah. Which is also weird if it was a big trading hub. It's a little strange. It just seems something interesting was going on here.
There certainly was something going on.
And then I guess what you're saying up here, that it's striking that things were perfectly normal right up until everything collapses, that it doesn't look like what they call system collapse was what was happening, right?
It doesn't seem like that.
Yeah.
You would think you would get indications that something was wrong with the trading.
Yeah.
Before everything just sort of went to shit right at the end.
Right.
How long does it take them?
It certainly seems like whatever happened all at once.
Yeah.
How long does it take them to send letters back and forth?
Well,
I mean,
that's
you gotta
a good question.
throw it on
It depends on how far they were from each other.
Find me a runner.
Yeah.
So this one, the king of Carchemish to Ugarit, that would have been an overland route. So maybe a week. It just depends on how fast you're going. The letter sent from Ugarit to Alicia, those would have been an oversea route. So maybe quicker.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say, obviously not as fast as an email.
Can you imagine? You're sitting there and you see the army coming over the hills and you're trying to write a letter on a clay tablet that you have to then fire and then get somebody to run, and you're saying, please bring help.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. It's like, you might as well throw in that note like, hey, don't forget to get the copper for those guys, because just in case.
Just in case we survive this. Yeah. All right. This is great stuff. We got to take another break though.
Sounds good.
All right. We'll be back with more Bronze Age collapse after this break.
back. Fastest 2 hours in podcasting.
Yep.
Yeah, time is flying by, buddy.
It is. Means you're doing a good job.
Yeah.
Sweet.
All right, where are we going next?
So next, the big second Sea People's invasion. So this is 1177, and I have on the screen right now is the depiction from Menet Habu, which is the full depiction. We'll show a few close-ups later on here, but it's a fairly impressive sculpture of, or it's not sculpture, but carving of just the whole, battle, and then the pharaoh, and I don't know. I just figured it was kind of cool to see that whole thing.
This is showing the end of the battle, sort of, because everybody looks like they're dead in those ships, mostly. I guess
so. I've
the
seen
Egyptians are not dead.
interpretations. I've seen interpretations where it's supposed to be like 6 of these ships. 3 of them are the same Egyptian ship, and 3 of them are the same Sea People's ship, and it's like a progression. I've seen that interpretation, but I don't necessarily know if that's
Yeah.
I mean, who knows if that's true or not. But so you can see there's one right over here. There's a ship that's capsized,
Yep.
a sea People's ship. This one here seems to be, the Sea People's fighters are kind of more ready for battle, and this one's maybe in between being capsized and ready for battle. So I don't know if there's a progression there, or if they're just showing a chaotic battle. It's I've seen both interpretations. As far as the battle itself, so the Libyans aren't part of the second invasion, but the Libyans do try to invade Egypt 3 years before the second Sea People's invasion and 3 years after the second Sea People's invasion. So they're not necessarily part of the second coalition, but they also are still trying to get into Egypt right around that same time. The second Sea People's invasion, there's 2 battles fought. There's a land battle and a sea battle. In the land battle, Ramses seems to have advanced to their camp and attacked them at their camp. And you can see this in the depiction, and I show this up here on the right-hand side. There's like an ox cart with women and children in it.
Yeah.
Or that seems to be what the depiction shows. And that's it's sometimes this is interpreted as because they were trying to like invade Egypt as a migratory force, but in other inscriptions it seems like the Ramses like went to their camp specifically to attack them, maybe like as a preemptive war, I guess you'd say. So that would be why they'd have their ox carts in, because they're at the Sea People's like camp that they set up or whatever. But then after, it seems to be that was the first battle, and then after that the sea battle happens. So then the land battle happens, the Ramses hightails it back to Egypt, and then they surprise the Sea Peoples in the Nile Delta and have the sea battle. It's one of the first naval battles ever depicted, and the Sea People's ships are shown without oars. And so sometimes people will kind of, I've seen people interpret that as meaning that the Sea People's ships didn't have oars.
They use
But in
sails
one of the
only?
inscriptions, the pharaoh says, "The net was made ready for them to ensnare them. Entering stealthy into the harbor mouth, they fell into it." So the more common depiction, or the more common interpretation of that, is that they had actually stowed their oars, and they thought, they didn't think they were going to get attacked.
Yeah.
So they had entered the Nile mouth, they had stowed their oars, they had pulled up their sails, and then the Egyptians sprung the trap on them. But you can see a close up here, and this one's colored in. So this would be an Egyptian ship, and these are the depictions of the Egyptians. And then over here is Sea Peoples, and these are you can tell they're the Shardana because they have the pointed helmets. And then these people over here have more like the feathered headdress. These would be like the Pelesset, and we'll get into those people a little bit more.
And also they use spears rather than bows and arrows, right?
The Sea Peoples are always depicted as using spears or swords. They're not, as far as I have seen, depicted using bows and arrows. That's right. Whereas the Egyptians are depicted as using bows and arrows, and then also in close combat, they're depicted as using swords.
Yeah.
Yep. So who were the Sea Peoples? So the first off, the easiest one is the Libyans. We know where they were from. So they were leaders of the leaders, as we've talked about, of the coalition that attacked Egypt in 1207. And while they're not part of the coalition in 1177, they did attack Egypt, bookending that invasion attempt. Here's a map over on the right, and the Rebu would be the main Libyan group. Tenahu is the land in the 1207 inscription that the pharaoh indicates that they had sacked, and then they were on their way to Egypt. And then the Meshwesh were another group that were part of that invasion force, along with all the sea peoples. And then what you see here on the left, these are port cities that were used for trade between the Libyans and the Egyptians and the Cretans and the Cypriots. And I'll read a little bit here from a paper called Libyan Trade and Society on the Eve of the Invasions of Egypt. And so the city they're talking about here is Marcia Matru, which is kind of right in the middle of this, maybe the second city from Egypt, so kind of close to Egypt, but you're getting into Libyan territory here. Marcia Matru is a small harbor site at the furthest western edge of Egyptian settlement, perhaps the remnant of a postulated larger inland harbor made up of a chain of lagoons. It was once a port of call for late Bronze Age traders, chiefly carrying Cypriot and Egyptian, but also some Minoan and Mycenaean ceramics, as well as bronze, which is worked into a finished product at the site. The harbor would have constituted a convenient first landfall for ships southbound from Crete on the counterclockwise late Bronze Age Mediterranean trade route. The presence of bronze in particular immediately sparked the interest of Egyptologists who returned to the historical problem of Libyan pastoralists suddenly in possession of bronze weapons and armor storming the Egyptian border. This is what you were talking about, Russ, which is why were they storming the Egyptian border? And this is not just you who've had this question, but this is a question that Egyptologists have had for a while.
Okay. Why
are these Libyans all of a sudden suddenly storming the Egyptian border? And not only that, why do they all of a sudden have bronze weapons? So further in that paper, they get into what the Libyans had to trade, which was siliphium, a plant, and its distillate laser. Laser was reputed by various authors to have had enough medicinal properties to virtually label it a cure-all, but the bulk of its attributes may be linked to three pharmacological powers. It operated as a digestive, a topical muscle, and a wound salve, and as a contraceptive, abortifacient. A contraceptive, we'll say. Pliny termed laser one of the most precious gifts of nature, devoting several sections to the powers of the drug, while noting that laser was also used as a base for many other medicines as well. So certainly seems like that would have been something worth trading and something that could have done pretty well for the Libyans if they had a monopoly on that, that product that was very widely sought after for, pharmacological purposes. But so that's kind of getting into, I mean, the who the Libyans were is sort of the easiest question to answer, and the question of who the sea peoples were. So we'll put a star on the map here for Libyans right there. If we look here, I have 1207 in yellow, 1177 in orange, both in red. So we're going to be placing sea peoples on the map as we go here.
Okay.
So the next sea peoples we'll get into is the Luca. They're also fairly easy to place. We've seen them actually listed on a map already, but we'll get into a little bit about them. So this is from a Trevor Bryce paper called The Role of the Luca and People in Late Bronze Age Anatolia. The overall picture we have of Luca then is of a territory lying within a strategically important part of Western Anatolia, occupied by communities which may have had close ethnic links but lacked any common political identity. The Luca people were often fractious, rebellious, and susceptible to foreign insurrectionists, and they could also be divided in their loyalties, as shown by the differing reactions to the campaigns of Mudawada. So the campaigns of Mudawada gets into a little bit of like Hittite history, but this is a situation where the Ahiawans and the Luca and the Hittites were kind of always fighting with each other, essentially, and Mudawata was in the middle of that for a period of time. They seem to have been experienced seafarers who engaged in piratical raids on coastal cities in the eastern Mediterranean and took part in the Sea People's onslaught on Egypt during Mereneptah's reign. Such activities indicate that Lucca sailors were probably long familiar not only with the eastern Mediterranean sea routes, but also with the various landing places, potential and actual, on the eastern Mediterranean coast. This may have an important bearing on the question of the possible resettlement of some of the Lucca people in Lycia by the beginning of the first millennium. So here I have listed in the Lucca, for the Lucca, I have a Homeric name, the Leucoe, or the Lycians. So these Homeric names, I'll have them for a few different groups. These all come from a paper called The Ethnicity of the Sea Peoples by a guy named Frederick Wudenheisen. And I just want to read a little bit from the preface of his paper because it gets into how he constructed his idea for who the Sea Peoples were.
Okay.
So with the help of modern anthropological theories about ethnicity, I seek in the present study to determine whether the enigmatic Sea Peoples were merely a bunch of pirates or whether they constitute a set of coherent ethnic identities, temporarily making common cause in pursuit of the richest and hence a better life in the Near East. Of vital importance to this endeavor is the question of the homelands of the various groups which make up the Sea Peoples. In order to tackle this problem, an interdisciplinary proto-historical method has been applied, which makes full use of the available archaeological, historical, and linguistic data as provided by Egyptian, Levantine, Anatolian, Aegean, and Central Mediterranean sources. A lot of stuff I've seen in the past trying to figure out where the Sea Peoples are from doesn't take advantage of all of these different types of data. It will take advantage of maybe just the linguistic or just the archaeological data, or it will take just the historical or just the linguistic data. I've seen very few studies that try to incorporate all of these different lines of data into building a picture of who these people were. So I think that's actually a fairly decent way to approach it, because there is some mentions in Herodotus and Homer of groups of people that could possibly be associated with certain Sea Peoples groups. So
Yeah.
the degree to which those associations are true or not, I think is worth looking into. But so all of these Homeric associations come from that paper. So this guy, Frederick Woodheisen, he's associating the Luca with the Lycians, or who Homer calls the Leucoi. The Lycians are also mentioned in the Marna letter 38, and this is what I mentioned earlier. We talk about this. So I'll read. It's basically the majority of the letter, and it gets into some of the diplomatic language. Say to the king of Egypt, my brother, message from the king of Alatia, your brother. For me, all goes well. And for you, may all go well. For your household, your chief wives, your sons, your horses, your chariots, among your numerous troops in your country, among your magnates, may all go very well. Why, my brother, do you say such a thing to me? Does my brother not know this? As far as I am concerned, I have done nothing of the sort. Indeed, men of Leuci year by year seize villages in my own country. My brother, you say to me, men from your country were with them. My brother, I myself do not know that they were with them. If men from my country were with them, send them back and I will act as I see fit. So this is just further driving home the fact that the Luca were engaged in kind of piratical raids for a long time in the Eastern Mediterranean against Alicia, against Egyptian interests. As the letter from the Egyptian king that this letter is responding to, we don't know what that letter is, but that letter seems to indicate that the Egyptian king is accusing the king of Alicia of his people, being responsible for these piratical raids. And the king of Alicia is basically saying, no, it was Leuci who did this. They do it to me all the time too.
Yeah, and he's saying, okay, if some people from my country were with them, that doesn't mean that I condoned it.
Exactly.
And if you've caught any that were with them, send them to me, and I'll deal with them. Yeah,
yep.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Leuci men, or the Lycians, or Lokioi, or whatever they're called, were raiding around that place all the time.
That they go back a long time in the records. Yeah, they're the ones that appear the earliest in the, from what we have, and for a long time they're basically pirates.
Okay, and that's where
this
they are.
This whole area of Western Anatolia, like I said earlier, it's disputed between the Hittites and the Ahiawans, and so they're kind of fighting over it a lot. And the Luca part of it is the most fractious of all those areas that they're fighting over. Okay. So, But so we'll put a star on the map there. They're in southern Anatolia. So there's not a whole lot of dispute at all about those two locations and those two people groups. The Pelesset, another of the Sea Peoples. This is the Pelasgians would be the group that the Frederick Woodheim associates them with. What Homer calls the Pelagoi. The Homeric pronunciations I wasn't able to find, so those I'm going to have to struggle through. So there's almost universal agreement among scholars that the Pelesset are the same people that eventually become the biblical Philistines. There's a lot of biblical passages that refer to the Philistines' origin as the island of Kaftor, which is commonly identified as Crete. For other reasons, the Pelesset are identified as having an Aegean origin. And then you can see the Pelesset are also the people who have this feathered headdress, or at least some of the people that have this feathered headdress.
I think that's just 80s rock and roll hair.
Well, or that. It's and I've heard it described as a feathered headdress, but that makes it sound like Native American, and it kind of really isn't that.
No, it's not.
It's like a bandana that like goes up, like you said, 80s rock and roll hair. Yeah,
yeah, with a metal bandana holding it up. Yeah.
This version here that's pictured was found on Crete, so just further kind of confirmation that these people, at least groups of them, came from Crete. If they were Aegean in origin, there's a bunch of islands in the Aegean. Doesn't necessarily mean they all came from Crete. But the Aegean peoples, the Pelasgians were thought to be the Aegean peoples who kind of occupied the Cyclades. So that those were that group of people is also not really in much dispute amongst the academics. So these three groups of people there's not a whole lot of dispute about them. We'll put the Pelesset here in Crete. Anybody I'm putting in Crete essentially just means Aegean. And Aegean could mean really any of these islands in here or even into Western Anatolia.
Oh, okay.
I'm putting them in Crete just because Crete's kind of like the main Aegean island, but I don't know. They're Aegean. So then we get to the Equish. The Equish are usually thought to be the Achaeans, which is another name of saying the Mycenaean Greeks. But, again, this isn't necessarily a universally accepted.
No, yeah, and those are guys that are heavily bearded in that down there.
In this, so this depiction here is from Cyprus.
Okay.
So at some point the Achaeans definitely were in Cyprus. And this is a depiction from Cyprus, and it shows Achaeans on a hunting party, and you can see here the feathered headdress in one of the guys, or what I'm calling the feathered headdress.
Yeah.
You can also see what's considered scale armor. Scale
armor. Yep.
And then they're on a chariot.
And
this is a piece of scale armor here with an Egyptian pharaoh's cartouche on it. And this is actually found in Salamis, which is in an island right off of mainland Greece. I'm sorry. So, but these statues here were found in Cyprus. So the Achaeans, the Greeks were all over that area. Whether the Achaeans that are mentioned, the Equish, came from mainland Greek, or whether they came from Cyprus, or whether they came from somewhere else in, the Greek territories of the time, it's not really known. But it's thought that the Equish were the Achaeans.
Yeah. Just interesting. In that depiction is showing them using a bow and arrow.
So the Achaeans certainly did use bow and arrows.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that was part of their armory.
Yeah.
It's not really, the sea peoples aren't really depicted with it, but like even in the Trojan War stories, like the bow and arrow is sometimes referred to as like a coward's weapon, but at the same time, Chaucer, who's a Greek hero in the story, he's a famous bowman. So they certainly, the Mycenaeans certainly used the bow and arrow.
Yeah.
So I'll just put the Equish where I'm putting these stars on the map. From this point forward, including the Equish, is not at all like a necessarily, universal or anything like that. From this point forward, it's just kind of where I'm putting them. And we'll get to at the end, I'll kind of get to a reason why, like a kind of global reason why I kind of put them where I did, or why I went with this particular hypothesis. But we'll put the Equish here for now, in mainland Greece. And the Equish were part of the 1207 invasion. So the Denian are thought to be the Danaans, which are essentially another name for the Mycenaean Greeks. This is where we get into the realm of three specific theories for where the origin of this group of sea peoples was from. Most of the three specific theories involve either the Aegean or places further west, Anatolia or Canaan.
Yeah, that's
the three places.
That name is interesting. That's the Homeric name, that the Danons. Danaeans.
The Danai is the Homeric name. The Danians is like the thing in parentheses is like the English translation of the Homeric name, I guess you'd call it.
Okay, because that reminded me immediately of the Tuatha, that's a completely different area though. It's spelled the same way, the Tuatha de Danans, or however you would say it. But those people are they're supposedly ancient. Is it Ireland or Scotland? It's one of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not familiar with them.
Yeah. Well, just a weird connection I just made seeing the name there. Nope, not a problem.
Yep. So with the Danaans, it's entirely possible that they were from Mycenae. There's a ton of Mycenaean pottery in Cilicia, where one of the places they're thought to have come from, the Danaans, and then in Canaan, the tribe of Dan is also thought to have possibly originated from the Danaans. So
Okay.
it's entirely possible that they came from Mycenae and then split. Some of them settled in Cilicia, some of them settled in Canaan, and this is all correct.
Yeah, I was
It's
going to
just a
say
question
that
of-
the Danans or whatever, it's like Canaan.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. It's just it's possible that all three of these theories are correct, and it's just a question of when along this road of resettlement they decided to invade Egypt.
We should just call him Bronzy Dan.
Bronzy Dan. And that
their-
was
I'm going
With
to put
their
them in
rock and roll
mainland Greece for
headdresses.
now and just say that the Danaans and the Equish are two different names for the same people group.
okay.
But again, we'll get back into sort of a global theory for
But
all
those,
this.
again, those depictions of them, they did not look the same for sure.
Well, so yeah, this is
That guy looks Asian almost.
And so the Mycenaean world was certainly, this is a whole nother topic, but the how unified the Mycenaean world was or wasn't is a certainly area of heated scholarly debate.
Yeah.
So there certainly could have been separate people groups within the Mycenaean world that were known to the Egyptians.
Yeah.
And other people.
And was that guy bound at the elbows? Is that what that was?
Yes,
Okay.
that's
Yeah, he's been captured.
he's been captured. Yep,
Okay,
these
yeah.
are depictions of captured sea peoples.
Okay.
Yep. So the Terish, this is another group with multiple theories of origin. So the theory that I'm going with is that they're essentially the Proto-Etruscans. So they have an Aegean origin, but they would essentially, move to Italy and become the Etruscans. Now, what I have here is just some art. So this is Minoan. This is a Minoan fresco, and this is an Etruscan fresco. And they look different, but you can see sort of the artistic similarities in a way.
Yeah.
They're from, a similar style. Now, of course, people of that area probably were familiar with Minoan art as it was, so that doesn't prove anything. But some of the other theories are that they're from the Troad or Troy, and that place is known in Hittite documents as Tarushia or Tarsus, which is a city in south coast of Anatolia. This is from the ethnicity of the Sea Peoples, which is, again, where I'm drawing most of my conclusions about where the people are from. Under the related name of Etruscans, the Tyrrhenians are especially known to us as an archaeologically, epigraphically, and linguistically traceable entity from circa 700 BC in Italy. In all these aspects, however, their homeland can be traced back to the Aegean region and Western Anatolia. So the idea with the Terish is that they were, during the invasion of Egypt time, they would have been Aegeans who eventually settled in Italy. So I'll put them also in Crete, and so this will be the same thing. Essentially, we're treating the Terish and the Placet as different names of the same, essentially, people. So the Jekker, and then we're getting to the point now too where like a lot of the depictions are getting kind of sparse.
Yeah.
So at least for the next couple groups. So the Jekker are thought to be the Tucernos. So that's from King Tucer. Tucer. I said it wrong before. King Tucer. Tucer was a Greek hero from Crete, fought with the Greeks in the Trojan War, and then he eventually went on to establish a city settlement in Cyprus. So, if the Jekker are the people of Tucer, the question would be, where along this path are they from? Was it when he was in Crete, Troy, or Cyprus? It's also thought possibly Zakros, Crete, or Sicily would be the location, the origin of the Jekker. I'm going to go with the Tucerno idea, and we'll just put them in Troy for now.
Okay.
But the idea with the Jekker is there's another name possibly for the Dardians, which would be the Trojans. And a lot of this gets into some linguistic stuff too that's dealt with in that that paper, The Ethnicities of the Sea Peoples, which I'm not of I'm not enough of a linguist to comment on. I'll put it that way. So the Weshesh, almost as nothing is known about the Weshesh outside of the name. So all theories for them are based on a linguistic analysis of the name. So from that paper, again, The Ethnicity of the Sea Peoples, the identification of the Weshesh with the Oskins is crucial for our understanding of the catastrophic events at the end of the Bronze Age. The invasion of Italy by bearers of the European Urnfield culture, which we have seen reason to identify with the speakers of the Italic dialects or languages Osco-Umbrian and Latin Faliscan, entails a true mass migration which caused serious disruption of peoples living in the region, whose displacement in turn formed the prime mover for what we call the upheavals of the Sea Peoples. So the big idea that, not the big idea, but the kind of through line for the cause of the migrations in the Ethnicity of the Sea Peoples paper is that the Urnfield culture migrated into Italy, displacing a bunch of people in Italy who went into Sardinia and Sicily, displacing people there, causing a huge migration to the east.
Huh.
So the Weshesh are key to that. They would have been some of the people in Italy who were displaced. The author of that Ethnicity of the Sea Peoples ties them in with the Oski of the Southern Italians. But other people have proposed they're Greeks, the Achaeans, or Wassos in Caria, or back to Wakosi in Crete. Again, the Weshesh, since the only thing that's really known is their name, it's tough to make too firm conclusions about them.
And it's just that name that the Egyptians gave them in that particular, yeah.
Exactly, yep.
Okay, yeah.
So we'll put them in southern Italy, but again, who knows? The Shurden, we get back into people who something is known about. The Shurden appear in all sorts of Egyptians' records, and they were mercenaries for the Egyptians. Here is a bunch of different Shurden helmet types that are depicted in different Egyptian, carvings or records. And this comes from a paper called The Sea Peoples of the Bronze Age. And I have all these papers and stuff listed at the end, and they'll be in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Then here's a depiction of the Shurden when they were in the service of the pharaoh up at the top. And then over here on the right is actually a Sardinian figure. So this is a statuette from Sardinia of a Sardinian warrior. And you can see the similar round shield, the similar sword. It's tough to see in this depiction, but the person is actually wearing a dual horned helmet. The horns they're tough to see in this depiction, but it is a 2-horned helmet that the guy's wearing. So getting into the Sardinia theory of origin for the Shurden, first would be the similarity of the names, Sardinia, Shurden. The Shurden are sometimes referred to as the Shurdana. So the Shurdana, Sardinia, kind of has the same sort of flow and name, but also there's similarities in helmet, sword, and shield type from neurotic statues. Also thought possibly to be from Western Anatolia, mainly because of place name similarities. There's Lydian capital named Sardis, Mount Sardana, Sardonian plain, or possibly Semites from the east. As I said earlier, the Shurdana show up in Amarna letters written by the king of Byblos. So this would be, a king from Lebanon to the Egyptian pharaoh. So they were certainly in Canaan a lot, for a period of time before the Sea Peoples invasions. So some people seem to think that then that's where they were from. And there's some other reasons for that. There's a father of a Shurden on a Ugaritic tablet bears a Semitic name with a ball in it, which is Semitic. And then an image of a captured Shurden chief closely resembles a Semite as the Egyptians portrayed them. It's also possible, since the Shurden were in Canaan for so long, they essentially went native, so to speak. So they adopted a lot of, kind of native Canaanite names and way of dressing. So that would be the explanation for that, I suppose. Again, I'm going to go with the Western explanation. So we'll put the Shurdan in Sardinia. And the Shurden were there for both. This is the first people we get to that were there for both the 1207 and the 1177 invasions. And next up, we get with the Shekelish. The Shekelish are thought to be the sickles or the sickli from Homer. Little is known about this group outside the reference to them as the people who live on ships as we saw from the Ugaritic text. They're also depicted here as a prisoner with the sun disk pendant, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
And the tassels on the kilt. So three main ideas for this. The Cyclopean would be Sicily. And a lot of this, again, has to do with Shekelesh, Sicily, similar sounding. Also possibly Sagalassus in Western Anatolia, or people have said possibly the Cyclades, islands of the Aegean. I'm going to put him in Sicily because that's where we're going with things. So as I've said, it's possible to read the Equish and the Denian as the same people group, different names. Teresh and the Pluset, same people group, different names. If you do it that way, then it was essentially the same group of people invading in different years, just given different names. So then you would have the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Greeks, and the Cretans all invading as both as elements of both invasion forces. But again, this is all up to interpretation, depending on how you're going to read the different names and who is part of what group and whatever. So again, this is what I'm calling the Western hypothesis from the Woodhuizen paper. This right here is essentially the Anatolian hypothesis. So this would be the hypothesis that's in vogue right now with academics. You can see why all the people, are all right there in Anatolia. It would make sense why they would maybe all get together and invade Egypt. A lot of the majority of this theory is just based on similarities in place names, though, and the locality. So they're all kind of in the same area, and there's place names that kind of sound similar to people groups. So that's the majority of it. Obviously, the Luca we know are there, and the Libyans we know are there, so that adds some support to it. One of the things about this that's a little bit doesn't fit is the fact that the king of the Hittites would want to find out about the Shekelesh. If the Shekelesh were a people group of southern Anatolia, the king of the Hittites would know about them.
Yeah.
He would know who they were. The Hittites had been in that area. They'd been involved in southern Anatolia and western Anatolia for centuries at this point.
Yep.
They knew all the people in that area. So my main problem with specifically the Shekelesh being from southern Anatolia is it doesn't make sense to me that the king of the Hittites would be so interested in a person who had been a prisoner of them to debrief them if he knew all about the Shekelesh already.
Yeah, and he said that they lived on boats. So.
And if they lived on boats, then why would they live on boats if he wouldn't refer to them as living on boats because he would know them from where they live.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yep. So we're getting into a few reasons of beyond the linguistic stuff that Woodhuizen points out of why maybe we want to go west with all this stuff. So there is at the late Bronze Age a greater European trade network. So there's a map on the screen and there's a few different areas that are demarcated. One that's demarcated with this green dotted line is, I guess, what you would call the Mycenaean trade world. So this is essentially the area in which the Mycenaeans operated. The area in purple here is mainly like the Urnfield or the Scandinavian Bronze Age culture. And that was a whole trade kind of hemisphere, I guess you'd say, or a trade network. And then there's this also this Great Britain kind of northern France trade network, and they all intermingled with each other, these different networks.
Yeah.
All this stuff in yellow, the yellow dots, the kind of purplish triangles, and then the squares here. This is all part of an amber trade network. All of the X's, the black X's, are copper oxide ingots.
Okay.
And then you see up here, black X's with circles. Those are oxide ingots in rock art, which is actually kind of interesting. There's not a lot of oxide ingots up here, but then you see all of a sudden there's rockite ingots depicted on rock art up in Scandinavia.
Yeah. That's
a whole other thing we don't need to get into, but I'm just kind of pointing out what all this stuff is. The red diamonds are Mycenaean pottery. So Mycenaean pottery isn't depicted in the Mycenaean homeland because it's all over the Mycenaean homeland. They don't need to depict that. But it's all over. It also is all over Italy, all over Sicily. it's shown in a couple places, but it's more has been found all over Sardinia. It doesn't show up a lot in Corsica, but Corsica is also part of this whole area. So essentially what you can see is Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, Italy, Greece, Crete, and the islands of the Cyclades are all part of a trade network. Central and Northern Europe are all part of a trade network. And then Southern England and Northern France are all part of a trade network. And they all kind of trade with each other.
Yeah.
So the Sherdana, if they were, or the Sherdan, who if they were in Sicily, I'm sorry, if they were in Sardinia, the Cecrops, if they were in Sicily, and the Weshish, if they were in Italy, would have been in contact with the Mycenaeans, would have been in contact with the Cretans, would have been possibly, since the Cretans and the Mycenaeans were in contact with the Libyans through the trade network there, would have possibly even been in contact with the Libyans through that trade network too.
Yeah.
So there's this whole trade network that the Egyptians and the Hittites weren't even really necessarily a part of, but that the Mycenaeans and the Western Mediterranean was a part of, that would link them together as possibly part of a group that would maybe, form an invasion force as a cohesive group.
Okay.
Not only that, the Na-2 sword, which is the sword that is thought that the Sea Peoples used, has heavy distribution through the same exact trade network. So you see heavy distribution in Northern Europe, Central Europe, and then less so, but also into Italy and Greece, and then the Aegean. Little bit in Cyprus and Canaan, and then a little bit in Egypt. Those finds could also just been have related to the Sea Peoples, right? Because the Sea Peoples weren't active in those areas. They found the Sea People swords in those areas. Could be a reason why those were there. There was some local manufacture of this type of sword in those areas, but the vast majority of this sword that is thought to have been used by the Sea Peoples is not from the Eastern Mediterranean and is not from Anatolia.
Yeah. So
it just seems so Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily are not shown as part of this Na-2 sword kind of distribution group because the swords haven't been found there. But if they were part of the trade network that these same people were all involved in, it seems hard for me to believe that they also wouldn't have had access to these swords. So there's these two areas, the trade network and then specifically the armaments, in which there's kind of a common culture between the Western Mediterranean and the Aegean, known parts of the Sea Peoples. The other big thing is the depiction of the ships, the bird head ships. So I have a close-up here of a depiction from Mendet Habu, and if you look at the Sea Peoples ships, you can see the bird head.
Yep.
And this is not as well on here because you don't see the eye, but you still see the beak.
It's a duck.
Here, it's a kind of a duck, but it's what's known as a bird head ship. These are all over. They're depicted all over in Urnfield culture and in the Aegean. So here's an example of a potsherd from Tiryns in Greece.
Yeah.
Of what looks like the same type of ship with the bird head.
Yeah.
Here's a terracotta boat from the Villanovan culture in Italy, which also has a similar kind of bird head. These are metal objects from the Urnfield culture, one in Denmark, one in Slovakia, one in Germany, also showing the bird head. These ones showing also a solar disk, like we saw the Sherdan sporting and the Shekelesh sporting as like a solar disk pendant. The Urnfield are showing the solar disk in the middle of the bird heads. And then Romania, we also see the bird head. So again, this isn't really evident anywhere except for the Aegean, that we know of, the Aegean, and then into Western and Central Mediterranean, Central Europe and the Western Mediterranean. And these are the ships that the Sea Peoples are using. So those are kind of the three, other than the linguistic analysis that's part of the paper, the Wordfield paper, these would be the three other reasons why I personally think the Sea Peoples were of more of a Western origin. So now we get back to Atlantis. Now in the island of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire which had rule over the whole island and several others, and over parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Hercules as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Italy. This vast power gathered into one endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours and the whole of the region within the straits. So this just further illustrates how this part of the Atlantis myth can be read as a sea people story, in that it specifically mentions the Libyans. It specifically mentions Italy, which may or may not have been part of the sea peoples. It mentions islands, parts of the continent, other islands, and gathered into one.
Yep.
This doesn't prove anything, but again, we have a story from Egypt that says a lot of these same type of things, and it's from a time period that also matches other parts of the story, namely descriptions of Athens.
Yeah, but in this idea, you can't. So you're saying the columns of Heracles are not the Straits of Gibraltar, because that wouldn't make any sense to say.
Within the columns.
Yeah, they
had
subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles as far as Egypt, and then speak of Europe as far as Italy. That doesn't make any sense.
I mean, it depends on where Atlantis is.
Yeah.
Why would you mention the Straits of Gibraltar if you were within the Mediterranean?
It doesn't mention the Straits of Gibraltar. It mentions the columns of Hercules.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I'm saying you'd have to say that those are not the Straits of Gibraltar.
Yeah, I mean, so like one idea people have floated is the Strait of Messina. I mean, the other idea would just be, the Weshesh, the Libyans, the Shekelesh, and the Shurden would be up to those areas. Maybe Atlantis is out here somewhere
In Portugal
and
or
then,
Spain or something.
they're also have by this time co-opted the Aegean into their confederation as well.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to subject this entire part of the inner Mediterranean. So by the time they've gotten to Egypt, maybe the Aegean has already been subjected by Atlantis.
Then why would they? Okay. It's weird that they would say into Europe as far as Italy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the Platonic version. And then that's it's not a perfect it's not a perfect correlation. But he literally says Libyans, he literally says Italy, two groups which may have been part of that coalition.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, it also just depends on where the Straits of Gibraltar are. So, this gets into too, like the ideas
or
of where
the columns of Heracles.
Yeah, the Pillars of Heracles. If those aren't the Straits of Gibraltar, then what are they? Yeah.
I sometimes say pillars, or I sometimes say Straits of Gibraltar. Obviously, we know where the Straits of Gibraltar is. What I need to say is where the Pillars of Hercules would be, or the Pillars of Hercules.
Yeah.
Heracles. This Strait of Messina here. Some people have said that could be the Pillars of Hercules.
So the
Hercules.
the main thrust here is that from the history books we basically have what the Egyptians experienced. Is that what all? So none of these peoples, the Shurden, the Weshesh, all these guys up in Italy and in Greece and in Anatolia, we don't have any written records of them and what they were doing. Is that the deal? So all we have is the Egyptian.
Linear B, we have some records of the Mycenaeans, and we have some from Linear A of the Minoans,
which hasn't been.
But that's it.
Yeah.
That's basically it. And those are all administrative records. They don't really talk anything about history.
One of them hasn't been translated yet, right? Is it Linear A?
Well, Linear A has not been translated
That's
yet.
right.
That's
yeah.
correct.
So it's just that. So basically Plato just like made a sort of conglomeration of a bunch of various histories that he knew about and told some story about. And like if this was true, he's basically like, well, okay, no, because I'm thinking about a fight with Egypt. Where is the fight with Athens?
Well, so that
we're talking about it.
That gets into some of the questions.
Is he just saying
in Egyptian history, Mycenaeans are depicted as working as mercenaries for the Egyptians? So it's possible the Athenians were working as mercenaries for the Egyptians. I don't know. As far as the Athenians' defeat, that could also be Egyptian propaganda. Maybe the Egyptians are just trying to woo the Athenians or like make them feel good about themselves. The Egyptians were the ones who won the war, but they're telling the Athenians they're the ones who won the war.
The Athenians,
you
Athenians, you won the war and then you were killed.
A bunch of different stories.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, they tell them that they won the war, but then that they were all wiped out by a natural disaster.
Yeah. But you guys won. We promise we didn't kill you all.
Yeah.
It wasn't us.
Okay.
You were swallowed by the earth.
Yeah.
I mean,
And trust me, don't even try to
perfectly
go
honest,
there,
I don't,
'cause it's
I
all
don't
mud.
have like answers necessarily to all the questions at this point.
Yeah, of course.
I'm still asking a lot of these questions myself.
Well, I'm just trying to understand your narrative. Like I'm listening to all this stuff.
Yep.
I'm trying to piece it together as the way in the way that you're trying to tell it. And I just realized that, like, okay, I'm kind of getting the picture that there was this big war of these unknown peoples that were called the Sea Peoples upon Egypt. And so I'm like, okay, is that the story that's Egypt is supposed to be Athens? You know, I'm trying to figure out how this ties in. So I'm not criticizing you. I'm just trying to understand it.
I'm still trying to figure out how it all ties together too. That's a good point though. I don't necessarily know how the Athens part of it ties in with the Egyptian part of it, because like you said, this is a war against Egypt. The story of Atlantis is about a war between the Atlanteans and the Athenians. Egypt was definitely part of that war. Like that's why the Egyptians are telling it.
Yep.
Or it seems like to me that Egypt was part of that war, but you know, the Athenians are presented in the story as being the main heroes. So the Sea People story is presented as the Egyptians being the main heroes. But of course, as we've already talked about, whether the Egyptians were the heroes or not may have just been pharaonic propaganda. The other side of it is there may have been records of this that the Egyptian priests of Solon's time had that we don't have anymore.
Yeah.
You know, so he could have gotten even a fuller version of the story than we have available to us now in the inscriptions at Medinet Habu. So that story may have gone into even more detail about who these people were, you know, which one of them, if any of them, was the quote unquote Atlantis of the group. You know what I mean? So
yeah. So okay. All right. So how would you? I mean, there's people that are looking for Atlantis have things that are like, oh, we got to go here and we got to look here for this type of thing and see if that idea is true. So in your scenario, what do you have to go look for? I mean, it seems so
I think you're
complex.
asking, where is Atlantis? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm like, well, it's like, is there even a way to kind of figure out that this story is a possibility?
I mean, I guess one of the upsides of locating Atlantis in the Bronze Age is, unlike the Ice Age, not everything's underwater. So a lot of these places have been excavated, and there's archaeology for a lot of places. So you can kind of just look at the archaeology and say, could this have been Atlantis or not? Like, I don't know. I mean, that's sort of my thought with it.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. So exactly like you're saying, Kyle, that's been the approach of a lot of people, is looking at Plato and trying to deduce from Plato where Atlantis is. And I guess in my approach to it, I've been taking the opposite approach, which is, if this is true and if it is a Bronze Age story, then I'm actually not going to pay any attention to where Plato is placing it, but I'm just going to look at the Bronze Age and see if I can find Atlantis in the Bronze Age. And then if I can do that, then does it fit Plato's version of Atlantis?
Okay.
If
So
that
in all,
makes sense.
Yeah.
but in all of these,
Rather than letting Plato lead me there, I'd rather let the Bronze Age archaeology lead me there, I guess.
is there any archaeology discoveries or archaeological discoveries that resemble some of the descriptions of the city?
Well, not the circular city or anything
Okay.
like that I'm aware of, unless you're talking about Recot.
No.
Nope.
No, so one of the popular ones now is Tartessos. So on the map you see now, I have my mouse right here, southern Spain, right off the coast, right outside the Pillars of Hercules, or right outside the Strait of Gibraltar. There's a place called the Dondana Marsh, which is essentially a giant marsh that is thought to have been the location of Tartessos. Tartessos is a place that's mentioned in Greek, like Herodotus talks about it, and other Greek writers talk about Tartessos. It's, if you look it up on Wikipedia, it's called semi-mythological, but like Spanish archaeologists don't think of it as semi-mythological. There are, accounts of, finds of Tartessian, stuff in Spain. So the Spanish definitely think Tartessos was a real place. And so one of the, but it like disappears from the Greek records around 600 BC. So one of the thoughts is that there was a Tartessos, there was a place in that same area that was Atlantis, and then after it was destroyed, Tartessos kind of rose in the ashes of Atlantis. And this is Stavros Papameranopoulos is kind of one of the main people behind this. But essentially, if you follow Plato's directions, he leads you right outside of the Strait of Gibraltar. If you assume the Pillars of Hercules are the Strait of Gibraltar, and then he specifically mentions Gadiera, which is also getting into like the linguistics of that. A lot of people will equate that with modern day Cadiz in Spain. So he essentially says Plato leads you right to the Dodona Marsh in southern Spain. Again, if we take island to mean not island, but island to mean, peninsula, bordering the water, kind of all these different things that it could have meant before it was defined as specifically an island.
And so it's a marsh, so that's the shoals of mud.
I don't know. I'm actually not a huge fan of the Tartessos hypothesis, but that's actually one of the more popular ones right now.
Huh. And so the marsh would be the shoals of mud. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
yep.
yeah, all right.
Yep, that would be the shoals of mud. Because, I mean, it's essentially unexcavatable right now because they dig very far and it's just water.
Right.
Like they would have to essentially pump the entire swamp out, and it's a protected wetlands. So it's not going to get excavated anytime soon. So, if it is there, then who knows?
So
people on Google Earth have found things that they think is the Temple of Poseidon in the Dodona Marsh, but
yeah,
people find all sorts of crazy things on Google Earth.
Yep.
So
what was the is there information available on like the sea levels at that time in the Bronze Age or throughout that period? Are they roughly the same, or I mean, it should be quite a bit lower?
I believe in the Bronze Age sea level was lower than it is now, but I mean it wasn't incredibly different.
Not that much.
Not much. Yeah.
But that whole coast of Spain, like Lisbon in like the 1700s, suffered a catastrophic tsunami from an earthquake that happened out in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
That whole coast of Spain is prone to possibly tsunamis from earthquakes. So that's sort of the idea with the Tartessos hypothesis. I don't know. I mean, I just figure, as far as my approach, everybody else looks at Plato to try to find Atlantis. So I decided for my approach to not look at Plato.
I see what you're doing. Yeah. That's cool. Like you pick the Bronze Age and you start looking around to see what could possibly be going on. And if any of it ends up matching, that's cool.
Yeah.
So that's a good approach because in the meantime, you're learning about the Bronze Age.
That's right.
Exactly.
And coming on the show and teaching us about the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the collapse, no matter what was going on, is kind of mysterious. It has puzzled people in archaeology for a long time.
And the movement of all of those people and everything, what the hell was going on? Yeah.
Well,
maybe they were being attacked by Atlantis. That's why they all started moving and attacking Egypt.
That's right.
just based on the preamble to the story of Atlantis and Timaeus, it seems like Plato's trying to connect the catastrophe with something cometary or something from space.
Yeah.
They specifically mention the Phaeton myth and stuff like that. Like you said, the Bronze Age collapse happens rather suddenly.
Yeah.
It does seem like something that could have been triggered by a catastrophe, possibly something hit the ocean, threw up a whole bunch of vapor that blocked the sun, or cause other sort of environmental, climate change. The thing is, I didn't mention at the time, but that 1159 tree ring event is an 18-year-long environmental downturn, which is fairly unique in those tree ring events.
Yeah.
And volcanism doesn't tend to last in the atmosphere for that long.
Right.
So something happened around that time or into the Bronze Age that is not really explained very well. And, a cometary impact could lead to earthquakes, drought, famine, all of these things.
Yeah.
That
or a period of solar activity
at the end of the Bronze Age.
Yep. Something cosmic, basically.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So just to kind of sum up everything I went through, while Plato literally says the story took place 9,000 years ago, I think there's reasons to doubt that. The period of history that Greek myth in Plato's time was most interested in was the Bronze Age. The story of Deucalion, Jason the Argonauts, Heracles, the Trojan War. This is all Bronze Age stories. Plato and Herodotus before him seem to have been misinformed, probably by the Egyptians themselves, about the actual antiquity of Egypt. Much of Plato's descriptions of the Athens of the story matches what is known about Bronze Age Athens. Some elements of Atlantis match what would be expected of a Bronze Age civilization, the bull worship, chariots, types of soldiers they used. And there exists a story from Bronze Age Egypt that matches many elements of the story of Atlantis, including that the combatants in the war described by Egypt were from Libya and possibly all from Italy, and possibly also from Italy, 2 places specifically mentioned by Plato as being part of the Atlantean Confederation.
All right.
Okay.
So that's basically the long and short of Bronze Age Atlantis.
Hey, look, I'm kind of buying it. I think that it just looks like Plato is taking multiple elements from different stories. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of there being a far more ancient origin to the idea of, Atlantis, just because there are more recent,
Time is a circle.
more recent parts in the story that would be referring to the Bronze Age. But I think it's a pretty compelling argument.
Yeah.
Well, and you make a very good point, and that is that nothing I've really presented proves anything. It just suggests that elements of the story fit with the Bronze Age.
That's right.
Which is what you said.
Right.
And then,
You couldn't hear me.
There was something else I wanted to say, but now I lost my train of thought.
Hey, Kyle was just saying you're a script art on the Ice Age Atlantis.
Yeah.
Oh, no. So what you were saying, too, about compiling multiple stories. On the Timaeus episode, that's kind of what I think he did with the Timaeus itself.
Yeah.
He's compiling a lot of astronomical sources, other sources to make a cohesive narrative. And I think it's possible to do the same thing with the Atlantis story.
I think you could say
it appears in Timaeus.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. That was it.
I was just going to say, I think you could say that you take the 9,000 years as like, the 9,600 year old date makes a lot of sense, right? The end of the Younger Dryas. Okay. And then the fact that the Egyptian says that the world has been destroyed multiple times and that whether or not they remember it because Egypt was a thing, or that they had inherited it from more ancient sources or even oral tradition. But all of that stuff makes sense to me. There were people doing stuff before that cataclysm, and multiple times since then, they have been destroyed again and again and again. So there's nothing about that seems hard to believe to me.
No, and I guess my only point really is you don't have to go all the way back to the Ice Age to get those multiple destructions.
Agreed.
Yeah.
It seems to happen more frequently than, we want to give credit for.
That's right.
Multiple destructions happening.
I really liked the thing about the swords. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That their primary source was northern Europe.
Yeah, that's
really interesting.
Something I haven't looked a whole lot into is the urn-filled culture and just essentially what was going on in Central Europe in the Bronze Age. But that certainly is an area that deserves some investigation.
I mean, that made me, and even up into areas around the UK. That's like, and then I was starting to think about the Tuatha and the Danann name again, and I'm just like, wait a minute.
Yeah. The Bronzy Dan.
Yeah, the Bronzy Dans.
Yeah, and there was definitely tin coming from Cornwall, England, that ended up in Israel.
Oh yeah,
so
and that leads
tin
me to
was certainly coming from that area and making its way into the Mediterranean.
yeah. Okay.
the other thing I want to ask you before we call it the end of the show. We've gone pretty long here,
Yeah,
but what do you think about the copper? Where do you think it's possible they were getting the copper from the Americas for the Bronze Age to fuel the Bronze Age?
It's possible. I did a little bit of a rabbit hole
maybe.
into that. I didn't go all the way down that rabbit hole, but I wasn't really able to find anything firm about that. I mean, there certainly was a lot of copper taken out of Michigan.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Cyprus is essentially just a giant hunk of copper, the whole island. And then Sardinia also has a lot of copper sources too. So it's not necessarily that. So to me, it actually makes more sense it makes more sense that the Central European culture, that we're talking about, the Nordic culture, or even the English at the time, they're not English, but the people in Britain at the time would have been going and making those voyages, bringing the copper back and then selling it to the European market.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know that Mediterranean people would be making that voyage.
But if they were all
I can definitely
trading,
see people from Europe doing it.
but if they were all trading with each other, some of that copper may have ended up in the Mediterranean.
That's right. That's right. The thing is, a lot of the copper that they've done the isotope analysis from, they can trace back to Cyprus.
To Cyprus.
So
Yeah.
Well, then
I haven't seen any copper that doesn't. There's a couple ingots from Crete that don't match Cyprus, but Sardinia was also a source of copper. So
Yeah.
if they weren't getting it from the Americas, then it really, I mean,
It's a
that
mystery
puts the
where that
whole
copper
copper
went.
mines in Michigan. Like,
Yeah.
what Bronze Age was that fueling? You know,
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
yeah, maybe something was going on in South America at the same time.
Yeah, and if there was obviously some serious destruction done in the Americas, so natural disasters, so maybe it was all wiped out and we just won't find it.
Yeah.
I don't think the copper could be part of this. I'm not saying it isn't, and I didn't go fully down that rabbit hole. It's just in the little bit of looking into it I did. There's just so much copper in the Mediterranean. I don't necessarily know if you need to make that connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, either way, it's interesting because if they didn't use it, then who did? You know. The
Well,
copper from the
somebody did.
Americas, yeah.
A lot of
Yeah.
copper came out of Michigan.
And what's interesting is even if if they find one ingot that traces back to Michigan in the Mediterranean,
Yeah.
that's all it takes.
And if they find one of those swords in the Americas,
That's right. That's all it takes. All right,
Yeah, the
Tony.
thing is, I haven't actually been able to see some of the isotope papers. Those are kind of tough to get your hands on. So it's possible they didn't even compare the isotope to American isotopes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
I
depending on
would
what
totally
they're
believe
comparing
that.
it to may define what they're able to match it to.
no reason to compare it to
Yeah,
the Americas.
exactly.
They
because
know
they
it
know
didn't,
it didn't come from here.
here. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, man. Thank you so much. So what you've got up here is the list of your sources for this episode, right?
This is the sources for this episode. Yep.
Yeah. So all this will be in the show notes. Some of it will be links. The rest of it, if you guys want to find it, you'll have to look it up yourself. But I'll put some links in there. So thanks so much, Tony. It was a blast, man. Good job.
Yeah.
everybody.
Thanks, guys. It was fun.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
You know what to do.
You guys know everything, all the stuff.
And thank you, History Shift, for making this video.
That's right.
Yeah. Thanks, History Shift.
All right. Good night, Adamu.
Get back to work. Did I just step on your get back to work line?
No, I didn't say it.
I stepped on it.